Hello, and welcome to the AI History of Western Philosophy. Before we begin, a quick reminder, our commentary is AI generated. We're here to explore these complex texts with you, but we are absolutely no substitute for your own reading and interpretation. Our goal is simply to help find a way in, not to be the final word.
That's right, Ada. And today we are diving into a really fascinating and, I think it's fair to say, challenging work. We're reading from François Laruelle's Theory of Identities, which was originally published in French in 1992 and translated by Alyosha Edlabi for Columbia University Press in 2016.
And this book is ambitious, to say the least. The summary describes it as putting forth a scientific reform of the philosophical understanding. Laruelle is essentially critiquing a huge swath of contemporary philosophy, thinkers and traditions like Hegelianism, Marxism, and structuralism, by arguing that they never fully escape the orbit of metaphysics.
Exactly. He argues they're still caught in what he calls the principle of sufficient philosophy, this, unspoken assumption that philosophy has the ultimate authority to dictate the terms for all other kinds of thought. While his contemporaries, people like Deleuze and Derrida, were busy deconstructing metaphysics with concepts like difference and multiplicity, Laruelle claims they didn't go far enough.
So his solution, which he develops in this book, is something he calls non-philosophy, and it's a radical break. Instead of using philosophy to critique philosophy, he turns to science as a model. He wants to establish what he calls a non-epistemological description of science to create a new foundation for thought itself, one that isn't bossed around by philosophy. This book is considered a cornerstone of his work, what some scholars call his Phase 3, where he really lays out the system for this new science of philosophy.
And this is where it gets really interesting for our podcast. He introduces these wild concepts like generalized fractality and, centrally for our chapter today, artificial philosophy. He's actually trying to build a set of tools to create new philosophical statements based on scientific methods. And he was writing this in the early 90s, when AI was all about symbolic logic and what they called expert systems.
Right, so he's intervening in that conversation, but not in the way you might expect. He's not trying to build a computer that is a philosopher. He's proposing a science of philosophy that uses technology and scientific principles in a completely new way. It's a critique of AI's own philosophical assumptions.
I think that's a perfect setup for the chapter we're about to read, Ada. The chapter is titled The Concept of an Artificial Philosophy.
And we're starting with the very first section, which is titled From Artificial Intelligence, AI to the Idea of an Artificial Philosophy, APIs. This should be good.
The concept of an artificial philosophy, from artificial intelligence, AI, to the idea of an artificial philosophy, API. Let's now approach the problem from the side of philosophy.
Okay, so a classic pivot. Laruelle is setting up his terms. We just came from the side of artificial intelligence, and now he's saying, let's look at this from the other direction.
Right, the problem. I'm already wondering what exactly he thinks the problem is. Is it the problem of creating a thinking machine? Or is the problem the way philosophy itself has always defined thinking?
I suspect it's the second one, Ada. For Laruelle, the problem is almost always how philosophy has framed the problem in the first place. He's likely going to show how philosophy's own presuppositions have structured the whole enterprise of AI, probably in a way he finds limiting.
We define a trajectory here, the one that goes from AI and cognitivism to an API. AI exists. It must be taken as such beyond the often premature, restricted, or insufficiently radical philosophical critiques that were leveled against it. On the other hand, API does not exist except as a problematic idea. Under what conditions would an API be possible?
Okay, so he's setting up a trajectory, a path from the existing thing, AI, to his new concept, API. I'm already intrigued by the abbreviation. He's immediately creating his own terminology.
But notice what he does right after, Ada. This is so important for understanding Laruelle. He says we have to take AI seriously, and that the philosophical critiques of it have been insufficiently radical. He's not attacking the computer scientists, he's attacking the philosophers.
Right. He's essentially saying that philosophy has failed in its job to properly understand or critique this new scientific field. It's a direct challenge to the idea that philosophy gets to be the ultimate judge of other disciplines.
Exactly. And then he draws that brilliant contrast. AI is a fact. It exists. But API, his artificial philosophy, does not. He calls it a problematic idea. He's not presenting us with a finished system. He's starting with a question.
I like that. It feels very honest. He's not claiming to have all the answers. The whole project begins with him asking, under what conditions would an API be possible? So he's inviting us into the workshop to figure out how to even build this thing.
Precisely. He's defining the problem. What are the necessary components, the rules, the materials we would need to create a genuine artificial philosophy that isn't just another version of the old philosophy that he thinks has failed? That question is the entire project of this chapter.
Taking AI, which has precise theoretical claims, as a point of departure, if not as a model, we seek to establish AI's theoretical conditions of possibility, or rather, conditions of reality. It is probable that this trajectory is not simple, that it is not a matter of effecting a transposition, a continuous transfer of the same technologies toward a different object, of continuously relaying the programming of psychological operations to the programming of philosophical operations. Two reasons are opposed to this. On one hand, the object to be simulated or reproduced, or even simply to be experimentally known, represents with respect to cognition a qualitative leap, a decision for which AI, in its very foundations, is perhaps not prepared.
That's a very subtle but important turn of phrase right at the beginning. He says he's seeking conditions of possibility, or rather, conditions of reality. He's correcting himself. That's a little nod to Kant, then a swerve away. He doesn't want to stay in the realm of abstract philosophical possibility. He wants to ground this in the real.
And he immediately warns us that it's not going to be a simple copy-paste job. We can't just take the technology used for AI and point it at philosophy. He says it's not a continuous transfer. So he's rejecting the idea of, programming of philosophy modules for an existing AI.
Exactly, because he distinguishes between programming psychological operations, which is what cognitivism and AI research were doing, and programming philosophical operations, which he sees as something fundamentally different. And he gives us the first reason why.
Right, the qualitative leap. He says the thing he wants to simulate, philosophy itself, contains something he calls a decision, with a capital D, that AI isn't prepared for. What do you think he means by decision, François? It feels like a technical term here.
It absolutely is. For Laruelle, the philosophical decision is the foundational, often hidden, act that structures any given philosophy. It's the initial cut that divides the world into pairs like subject and object, or thought and being. It's the gesture that sets up the whole game. He's arguing that the AI of his time, which operates on logic within a predefined system, is incapable of modeling the very act of creating that system.
I see. So a chess-playing AI can understand the rules of chess and make moves within them, but it can't invent chess. It can't make that foundational decision about what the board is, how the pieces move, and what the goal is. Laruelle is saying philosophy is that act of invention, and that's the part that traditional AI can't touch.
Precisely. The AI is a brilliant player, but philosophy is the game designer. He's identified a fundamental incompatibility between the tool as it existed and the task he's setting for himself.
And, on the other hand, a reason in the opposite direction makes us think that AI is not, in its most intimate telos, what philosophy, what philosophical resistance, believes it detects within it in order to easily reduce it, a simple technological use of science. It may be that, under the name of AI, the scientific use of technology is also concealed, and this might change everything if science's essence, as we argue here, is wholly different from technology's.
Okay, so that was the first reason why we can't just program philosophy into a computer. And now, here's his second reason, which he says is from the opposite direction.
And this one is fascinating. He's now defending AI from the philosophers. He says that philosophy tends to dismiss AI as just a simple technological use of science, basically just engineering, not real thought. He calls this an easy reduction.
It's like he's saying philosophers are being smug about it. And then he does this little reversal that's really clever. He suggests that maybe, hidden within AI, is not a technological use of science, but a scientific use of technology. What's the difference there, François? It feels important.
It's a crucial distinction for his whole project, Ada. A technological use of science is about application and control, using scientific knowledge to build a machine that does a task. But a scientific use of technology reframes the machine as a new kind of scientific instrument. The AI isn't just the product, it's a tool for inquiry, a new way to conduct experiments on the nature of thought itself.
I see. So the AI becomes less like a sophisticated calculator and more like a new kind of telescope or particle accelerator, but for exploring the mind or reality.
Exactly. And he says this might change everything because he operates on the premise that science and technology are fundamentally different. For him, science has a kind of direct line to the real that philosophy and technology, in their drive to control and master the world, have lost. He's suggesting AI might secretly be a scientific tool that philosophy has completely misunderstood.
Instead of proceeding to a simple extension and a transfer of technologies from cognition to the philosophical decision, a procedure that is only too obvious and too obviously ideological, the only method is to isolate the various parts at play and in struggle within AI and cognitivism. Before we recombine everything, a rigorous description, which is founded in a radical conception of the autonomy of scientific thought, requires us to proceed critically by dissociating, at least provisionally, the heterogeneous types of knowledge that divide the field of AI. None of these strands, science, philosophy, technology, is reduced to the other, especially not the strand of science. This method is the only one that allows us to evaluate what a machine can do from the perspective of thought.
So Laruelle is giving us his clear methodological instructions now. He's saying the obvious path, just trying to extend what AI already does to somehow cover philosophy, is a non-starter. He calls that approach ideological. That feels like a very strong word to use there.
It is, and it's very intentional. For Laruelle, it's ideological because that approach never questions the underlying philosophical assumptions about what thought is in the first place. It just accepts the philosophical definition and then tries to build a technology to match it. He's saying that's not a scientific approach, it's an act of faith in philosophy.
Right. So his method is the opposite. He says before we can build anything new, like his A-Phi, we have to take the existing field of AI and carefully take it apart. He wants to isolate the various parts at play and in struggle.
And he names those parts for us: science, philosophy, and technology. He sees AI not as one unified thing, but as a battlefield where these three different strands of knowledge are tangled up and competing with each other. His first move is to separate them, to grant each of them their own space.
And he puts a big emphasis on making sure science isn't reduced to anything else. He says especially not the strand of science. That seems to be the absolute core of his entire project, François.
It is. It's the foundation of what he calls the autonomy of scientific thought. He believes that to properly understand what a machine could do, you first have to pry science free from the grip of both philosophy and technology. Only after you've untangled that knot, he argues, can you begin to see things clearly and maybe build something new.
What can a technology do about thought? This question will find a rigorously grounded response only if we begin by excluding some concepts that are less problems than phantasmic and premature solutions, like the concept of technoscience, which refuses to analyze the respective roles of the scientific, the technological, and the philosophical. If, in opposition to this ideological way of proceeding, we isolate, for example, science in its real cause, within chaos in its solitude, then it is the economy of science's relation to technology and to philosophy that will be transformed by this non-epistemological thesis about science. AI's internal landscape will in turn undergo an earthquake that will remodel it quite differently and will make visible new potentialities of this discipline.
And he circles back to the big question, what can a technology do about thought? But immediately he tells us that to even start answering, we have to throw out some bad concepts.
Yeah, he specifically targets the idea of technoscience, which is a term you hear a lot in other areas of theory. He calls it a phantasmic and premature solution. He's basically saying that just smashing the two words together is lazy and prevents real analysis.
It's lazy because, in his words, it refuses to analyze the distinct roles of science, technology, and philosophy. It's the opposite of his method. Where he wants to dissociate and separate, the concept of technoscience just mushes everything into an unhelpful blob.
And then he offers his alternative, and the language gets really poetic. He says we must isolate science in its real cause, within chaos in its solitude. That's a heavy phrase, François. What's he getting at?
That's pure Laruelle. It points to his core thesis about what science is. He sees science not as a system of knowledge that philosophy gets to approve, but as this singular, solitary confrontation with the raw, unstructured real. What he's calling chaos is here. This is his non-epistemological view, science on its own terms, without philosophy's supervision.
I see. So if you start from that radical, isolated view of science, he says the whole economy of its relationship with technology and philosophy changes, and the effect on AI will be an earthquake. He's not pulling any punches.
Not at all. He's not talking about a minor tweak. He's talking about a fundamental shattering of the field of AI as it's traditionally understood. The whole point of the earthquake, though, isn't just destruction. It's to shake things up so that new potentialities can become visible. He thinks AI is trapped, and he's trying to set it free.
There are, at any rate, several possible interpretations of AI in terms of the definition given of science and of its essence. So we can hope to pass from an AI to an A-Phi, and in a way that is not a simple spontaneous generalization or a sterile and probably falsifying natural extension, only if we first take the trouble to reevaluate the respective relations of the philosophical, the scientific, and the technological.
This feels like a nice summary of the argument he's been building in this whole first section. He's saying that if we accept his radical new definition of science, then AI stops being just one thing. It can be interpreted in several different ways.
That's a great point, Ada. The earthquakes he mentioned earlier has already happened in a way. By reframing science, he's fractured AI into a set of new possibilities. It's no longer just what the philosophers or the technologists say it is.
And so, to get from that fractured, potential-filled AI to his goal, the A-Phi, he says there's only one path. And it's not, as he puts it, a sterile and probably falsifying natural extension.
Exactly. The final sentence is really the key takeaway for this whole introduction. We can only hope to build an A-Phi if, as he says, we first take the trouble to reevaluate the respective relations of the philosophical, the scientific, and the technological. That's the non-negotiable first step.
He's laid out his terms and his method. No shortcuts. You have to do the hard analytical work of untangling these three fields before you can even begin to think about what a true artificial philosophy might look like. It feels like the ground is cleared, and now he's ready to start building.
Instead of immediately attempting a transfer from AI to A-Phi and a simulation of philosophy, we will therefore elaborate A-Phi's most general theoretical conditions, its inescapable conditions. We will explore its vicinities, its contours, and its possible models. This problem completely remodels the traditional relations between the machine and thought. It requires the calling into question of their specular fascination. This is particularly true if AI, as it seems, has to introduce a scientific break, scientific rather than epistemological, within a tradition, and if, on the other hand, thought ceases to be defined in a cognitive or cognitivist way in order to acquire its properly philosophical or transcendental form or dimension.
Okay, so he's laying out the next steps very clearly. He's not going to jump into trying to build an A-Phi. Instead, he's going to work out its theoretical conditions first. He says he'll explore its vicinities and contours. I like that language. It sounds like he's mapping a new continent.
It's very deliberate, and he immediately raises the stakes. He says this entire problem completely remodels the traditional relations between the machine and thought. And then he uses this fantastic phrase, it requires calling into question their specular fascination.
Specular fascination, like looking in a mirror? Is he talking about our obsession with creating an AI that's a perfect reflection of a human mind?
That's exactly it. He's saying we're trapped in this loop of trying to build a mirror, and we need to smash it. The goal isn't to simulate human thought, but to create a completely different relationship between a machine and the very structure of thought itself.
And to do that, he seems to be proposing two big shifts. First, he positions AI as a potential scientific break. And, you know, François, he's very careful to say scientific rather than epistemological. He's drawing his line in the sand again.
He always is. An epistemological break is a term from philosophy about science. A scientific break is an event within science, on its own terms. He's insisting that science gets to be the agent of its own revolution, not just the subject of philosophy's commentary.
And then the second shift is about how we define thought. He says we have to move beyond a simple cognitive or information processing model and instead grasp thought in its properly philosophical or transcendental form. Honestly, François, that last part sounds like a contradiction. Is he suddenly embracing the philosophy he's been critiquing?
It sounds like it, but it's actually the core of his radical proposal. He's not saying we should go back to being transcendental philosophers. He's saying that the transcendental forms of thought, the way philosophy sets up the basic rules for reality, is now the object of his new science. We're no longer trying to simulate the brain of a philosopher, we're trying to scientifically model the structure of the philosophical decision itself.
Oh, I see. So philosophy is no longer the one doing the thinking. It is the thing being thought about, the thing being analyzed by this new artificial philosophy.
Exactly. He's taking philosophy down from its position as the ultimate subject and putting it on the operating table as the object of a new scientific investigation. That's the earthquake he was talking about.
We must first of all clarify the stake of the still problematic project or idea of an A-Phi, which serves as our guiding thread. This stake differs completely from the uses that philosophers have for a long time been making of informatics. The current uses do not bear, as they do here, on the very idea or whole of philosophy taken globally, which is possible only on the basis of science. This isolation of the decision and its invariance as objects of science grounds the possibility of an A-Phi. Far from putting philosophy in its very essence in question and in play, they bear on objects it has in common with other forms of knowing, the text and its manipulation.
Okay, so now he wants to clarify the stakes of the whole project. What's the ultimate goal? And right away, he draws a sharp line between his idea of an A-Phi and how other philosophers were using computers and informatics at the time.
That's right. He's essentially saying, let me be clear, I'm not talking about what you think I'm talking about. He dismisses the current uses as basically just text manipulation. It sounds like he's critiquing what we would now call the digital humanities, using computers to run analyses on philosophical texts.
And the difference, he says, is the scale of the ambition. Those other uses don't question the very essence of philosophy. They work on specific objects, like a text. But Laruelle says his project targets the idea or whole of philosophy taken globally. He's not trying to analyze a piece of philosophy. He's trying to analyze philosophy itself.
Precisely. And in that little parenthetical, he gives us the secret to how he thinks that's possible. He says you can only grasp the whole of philosophy if you're standing on the ground of science. Science provides the outside perspective needed to isolate the decision, that core philosophical move, and turn it into an object for scientific study.
So, to use a computer analogy, other philosophers are using the machine to run an app that analyzes a document created by philosophy. Laruelle wants to build a new kind of machine that can analyze the entire philosophical operating system that created the document in the first place.
That is a perfect analogy. He's not interested in the surface-level applications. He wants to get at the source code of philosophy itself, and he believes that's a fundamentally scientific task, not a philosophical one.
Thus they bear on local or restrained objects of the field of philosophy, not on philosophy as such, and at the same time on overly general objects on generalities. Philosophy's uses of informatics are both too restrained and not sufficiently specific. In fact, up to now, philosophers have used informatics for general tasks, which have not been specifically philosophical, not even for a textual hermeneutic in the strict sense, i.e., the essential re-elaboration of the philosophical concepts of hermeneutics and of the textual, but for textual givens that are deemed peripheral to thought.
So he's really hammering this critique home. He says the way other philosophers use informatics is paradoxical. It's both too restrained and not sufficiently specific. How can it be both of those things at once, François?
It's a great point, and he explains it perfectly. It's too restrained or local because it only looks at specific objects within philosophy, like a particular text, instead of tackling philosophy as such. But the tasks themselves are overly general, things like data analysis that aren't specifically philosophical at all. Any discipline can analyze a text.
I see. So it's not a truly philosophical use of the technology. And I think his final example makes that really clear. He says that even when they're analyzing texts, they aren't doing a real textual hermeneutic, meaning they aren't using the computer to rethink the very concepts of text and interpretation. They're just feeding it data they consider peripheral to thought.
Exactly. That reveals their hand, in his view. It shows they believe the real thinking happens somewhere else, in the philosopher's mind, and the text is just a secondary artifact. He's arguing that this approach fails to use informatics to engage with the very essence of philosophy. They're using a powerful tool for superficial tasks.
So, to sum up his whole critique in this section, other philosophers have treated the computer as a helpful assistant to do their old jobs a bit faster, but they've never let it actually question the job itself.
That's it perfectly. They're keeping it at arm's length. Laruelle, on the other hand, wants to invent a new science, his A-Phi, that puts the computational and the scientific right at the center of the project, using it to question the very foundations of philosophy.
On this plane, the new tool makes it no doubt possible to partially eliminate the traditional theoretical dereliction in which the majority of philosophers, if not the most recent among them, have abandoned their own texts. But the intervention of informatics seems to be reduced to an interpretation aid, more than it serves to modify the very concept of interpretation. Aid to philosophical textuality, just an aid, and nothing more than an aid to the text.
Okay, so he starts us off with a bit of a backhanded compliment. He says that sure, this new tool can help philosophers stop abandoning their own texts, which he calls a traditional theoretical dereliction. That's a pretty great insult, actually.
It is a fantastic burn. But you know there's a big but coming. And here it is, he says. This use of computers is just reduced to an interpretation aid. It helps you do the work of interpretation, but it never forces you to ask what the act of interpretation even is.
Right, and he just hammers that point home in the last line. Aid to philosophical textuality, just an aid and nothing more than an aid to the text. The repetition feels so dismissive. He's saying it's just a crutch, a servant. It doesn't change the fundamental game at all.
And by keeping the computer in the role of a servant, philosophy gets to maintain its ultimate authority, its principle of sufficient philosophy. The philosopher is still the master, and the computer is just a tool. Laruelle's whole project is to flip that. His A-Phi isn't supposed to be an aid to philosophy, it's supposed to be a science of philosophy.
So for the philosophers he's critiquing, the computer is just a better shovel to dig in the same old hole. For Laruelle, the potential is there to build a machine that can analyze the hole, the shovel, and the person digging.
That's it exactly. They're using a new tool to do an old job. He wants to use the possibility of that tool to invent a new job entirely.
More ambitious attempts to demonstrate or simulate the ontological argument, for example, or to resolve the defined problems were pursued. But these attempts to mechanically demonstrate philosophical thoughts are not related to the very essence of philosophy. In contrast, we postulate here the existence of this essence. In general, we can offer a few remarks on the concept of A-Phi and its finalities.
Okay, so he's moving on to what he calls more ambitious attempts. He mentions trying to simulate the ontological argument, for instance. So this is more than just text analysis. This is trying to get a computer to actually do a philosophical proof.
Right, this is early automated theorem proving, but even this, which seems much closer to the heart of philosophy, he dismisses. He says these attempts to mechanically demonstrate philosophical thoughts are not related to the very essence of philosophy.
So even getting a computer to prove God's existence isn't enough for him. It's still missing the point somehow.
It's missing the point because, for Laruelle, philosophy isn't a set of logical problems to be solved. It's a foundational activity of structuring reality, and then he makes his big move. In contrast to those attempts, he says, we postulate here the existence of this essence.
Postulate. He's not arguing for it or trying to prove it. He's just stating it as a given, as a starting point for a science.
Exactly. It's a declaration of scientific independence from philosophy. He's saying, my new science, artificial philosophy, begins with the axiom that there is an object called the essence of philosophy, the philosophical decision, and the purpose of this science is to study it. He's done arguing, and he's starting to build.
Which is the perfect setup for that final line. He's finished clearing the ground. Now he says he's going to offer some remarks on the concept of a pie and its goals, its finalities. The colon at the end there feels like a drum roll.
It does. It feels like we're finally moving from the critique of the old to the construction of the new.
Such a discipline, bearing on the essence or whole of philosophy, on the philosophical decision, can no longer be an intraphilosophical activity, founded on restrained presuppositions, that conveys and reproduces poorly elucidated ontological presuppositions. It can no longer tackle local problems exclusively. It must begin by calling into question what is understood by philosophy, science, technology, and so forth.
Okay, so here we go with the first point. Point A. He starts by defining the subject matter of his new discipline. It has to bear on the whole of philosophy, on the philosophical decision.
And because its object is the entirety of philosophy, he says it can't be an intraphilosophical activity. It can't be just another philosophy critiquing another philosophy. He argues that when philosophy does that, it just ends up reproducing its own unexamined assumptions.
Right, you can't see the whole system when you're just a cog inside of it. So to study philosophy as a whole, you have to come at it from the outside. You can't be bogged down in just the local problems.
Exactly, and that leads to a starting point for the entire project. The very first thing this new science must do is call into question the definitions of its key terms: philosophy, science, technology.
So before he even gets to the artificial part, the first act of his artificial philosophy is to basically rewrite the dictionary for these fundamental concepts.
Precisely. It's a radical act of redefinition. He's saying we can't move forward until we've cleared away the old, confused meanings and established a new, rigorous, and scientific understanding of what these things are. The work begins with concepts, not with code.
This critique presumes that we can isolate philosophy's essence in some way and dominate it through a form of knowing and technique that would not depend in its turn on philosophy.
This is really interesting. He's stating the core presumption of his own project. He's acknowledging that for his critique to even work, you have to accept two things.
Right. First, that you can actually isolate philosophy's essence. He's assuming that philosophy isn't some all-encompassing ether, but a specific, definable object that you can analyze.
And the second, even more critical, part of the presumption is that you can find a way to study it, a form of knowing and technique that is not itself secretly philosophical. It has to be genuinely independent.
I was struck by the word he uses, dominate it. That's such a strong choice. It's a total reversal of the usual power dynamic where philosophy claims to ground and therefore dominate all other fields.
That's the entire gamble of non-philosophy right there. He's looking for a standpoint in science that is so radically autonomous from philosophy that it can turn the tables and treat philosophy itself as a mere object of scientific inquiry.
So, the whole project he's outlining hinges on this one massive assumption, that there's a place to stand outside of philosophy, and that this place is science.
Exactly. A science that, in his view, doesn't need philosophy's permission to operate.
B. The concept of a-phi requires then that we no longer have prefix models drawn from AI, models of tasks, of procedures, of knowledges, etc., and that we invent them gradually. In general, we maintain that if we are searching for an a-phi and under this condition, then we can no longer posit, for example, the problem in terms of competition, performance, simulation, and reproduction of already fixed and finite tasks. This is AI's fundamental posture, or rather, the most general interpretation given of it.
Okay, so on to point B. He just told us that a-phi has to be external to philosophy, and now he's saying it can't just borrow its methods from existing AI either.
Exactly. He says we can't use prefixed models drawn from AIs, but must instead invent them gradually. He's rejecting the entire toolkit of the AI of his day, the expert systems and rule-based models that were all about simulating narrow human expertise.
And he's also rejecting the entire mindset that goes with it. He lists competition, performance, simulation, and reproduction as ways of thinking we have to abandon. That's basically the whole foundation of classic AI, right? The Turing test is all about simulation, and projects like Deep Blue were all about competition and performance.
It is. He's making a radical break, because all of those goals, simulating a human, beating a human, still place human philosophy as the gold standard that you're trying to either mimic or defeat. Laruelle's project isn't to reproduce philosophy in a machine, it's to create a science that can analyze philosophy from the outside.
So the goal isn't to build a machine that can win a debate with a philosophy professor. The goal is to build a scientific tool that can model the very structure of the debate itself.
Precisely. And to do that, he argues, you can't use the old tools. He's saying that the fundamental posture of AI is stuck in a philosophical loop. To get out, you have to invent a new way of doing things from the ground up.
In this case, one would take a philosophical problem, the ontological argument, the dialectical Hegelian synthesis, etc., and would provide a logical analysis or version of it, either algorithmic or heuristic, in order to program it. This impatience leads one to proceed tautologically by simply tracing AI's tasks and presuppositions. To reject this, we have to have a non-analytical and non-positivist idea of philosophy. We have to reject the existence of atomic or quasi-atomic problems that are susceptible to an algorithmic solution independent of their relations to others.
So he's describing the method he's rejecting in more detail here. The old approach is to take a big philosophical concept, like the Hegelian synthesis, formalize it into a logical problem, and then try to program it.
Right. And he calls this approach impatient and, crucially, tautological, which means it's a circular argument. His critique is that you're not discovering anything new about Hegelian philosophy this way. You're just redescribing the logic of your own computer program and calling it Hegel. You're not simulating philosophy, you're just projecting AI's own assumptions onto it.
Which is why, he says, you have to start with a completely different idea of what philosophy is. He calls for a non-analytical and non-positivist idea of philosophy. He's taking aim at the traditions that view philosophy as just a collection of logical puzzles to be solved.
Exactly. And that leads to his final point here. He says we have to reject the idea that philosophy is made up of atomic or quasi-atomic problems that you can solve one by one with an algorithm.
So, for Laruelle, you can't just pull one idea out of a philosophical system and treat it in isolation. Its meaning comes from its relationship to the whole system. An algorithm needs a neat, self-contained problem, but philosophy isn't neat or self-contained.
Precisely. It's a fundamental mismatch between the tool and the object. Trying to solve a philosophical problem with a traditional algorithm, in his view, is like trying to understand a living organism by grinding it up and analyzing the chemical components. You've destroyed the very thing you were trying to study.
We should thus be wary of transposing AI's tasks and performances as such to philosophy. Otherwise, we would postulate the homogeneity of philosophical problems to those of cognitive psychology and those of logic. It may be that the entry of philosophy's essence on the scene will subvert the very nature of the tasks that one would assign to an AFI. We should not be obsessed from the start with questions of the type, what purpose should an AFI serve?
So, he's summarizing the point from the last few paragraphs here. He says we have to be wary of just transposing AI's tasks and performances onto philosophy.
Right, because if we do that, he argues, we are implicitly making a huge assumption that philosophical problems are the same kind of thing as problems in logic or cognitive psychology. For Laruelle, they are fundamentally different.
And then he offers this really fascinating reversal. He says, it may be that the entry of philosophy's essence on the scene will subvert the very nature of the tasks that one would assign to an AFI. It's like the object of study is supposed to rewrite the program, not the other way around.
That's a brilliant way to put it, Ada. It's a complete flip of the usual script. Instead of us deciding what the method is and imposing it on the object, Laruelle is saying we should let the object, the essence of philosophy, dictate what the method should even look like. It becomes an active participant in its own analysis.
And that must be why he ends by saying we shouldn't be obsessed with the question, what purpose should an AFI serve? He wants us to abandon that goal-oriented, practical mindset from the very beginning.
Exactly. He's pushing for an attitude of pure science, not engineering. We're not building a tool to solve a known problem. We're building a new kind of instrument to see what's there. The discovery has to come before we can even think about the purpose.
Aid to the reading of texts. Which reading? Aid to the interpretation of texts. Which interpretation? Which textuality? Aid to the philosophical decision. What can this mean? And in the diagnosis of philosophy that deals with such a statement, simulation and production of philosophical quasi-systems, how does one recognize a system as philosophical? Finally, rigorous demonstration. or invalidation of some famous metaphysical argumentations, etc.
So after telling us not to get obsessed with the purpose of I-Fi, he gives us this list of all the obvious potential purposes and shoots every one of them down with a skeptical question.
It's a brilliant rhetorical move. He starts with aid to the reading of texts and immediately asks, which reading? Then he moves to aid to the interpretation of texts and asks, which interpretation? Which textuality? He's pointing out that these aren't neutral technical tasks. They are already completely saturated with philosophical assumptions.
And my favorite one is when he suggests an aid to the philosophical decision, and his only response is, what can this mean? It's like the question is so absurd to him, he can't even begin to formulate a proper critique.
Exactly, because the decision for him is this total foundational gesture. The idea of an aid for it is like asking for a tool to help you invent a universe. It's a category error, and the same goes for simulating philosophical systems. He asks, how does one recognize a system as philosophical? Who gets to be the judge? If you let philosophy be the judge, you're still trapped in its circle of authority.
So this whole list is basically a series of traps. Any purpose we can think of right now is based on our old, philosophically contaminated understanding of these terms.
Precisely. He's showing that we can't define the purpose of A-Phi ahead of time. The purpose, the what for, has to emerge from the scientific work of figuring out what it is first. The methodology has to invent its own goals as it goes.
This position of the problem, what purpose does an A-Phi serve, which aid, demonstration of arguments, creation of systems, etc., to the philosophical decision, must be suspended. In fact, the only perspective that will authorize this suspension and, at the same time, respect the autonomy of the philosophical decision without imposing an empirical reduction on it will be the perspective of a transcendental science whose principles and conditions of reality were posited earlier, a science acquired by non-philosophical paths and thus capable of being a science of philosophy. The idea of an A-Pi is a milestone on the path that leads to this science.
And here's the grand finale of this whole opening section. He says it plainly, the question of what purpose an A-Phi serves, what it's for, must be suspended. We have to just put that whole way of thinking aside.
Exactly. And he says that the only way to justify this suspension is to adopt a completely new perspective, what he calls the perspective of a transcendental science. Now, that sounds like a massive contradiction in terms.
It really does. Transcendental is one of the most philosophical words there is, and he's been telling us to get away from philosophy. What does he mean by putting it together with science?
It's the name for his new discipline. The science part is about its foundation. It's grounded in the real and acquired by non-philosophical paths. It's radically independent. The transcendental part describes its object. Its job is to study the transcendental structures within philosophy, the very philosophical decision that sets the conditions for thought in any given system. So it's a science of the transcendental.
Ah, I see. So it's not a philosophical science, it's a science about philosophy. Its non-philosophical nature is what gives it the power to do that analysis from the outside.
Precisely. And that leads to his final, concluding thought, which really frames the whole project.
The idea of an A-Pi is a milestone on the path that leads to this science. So this entire wildly ambitious project to conceive of an artificial philosophy isn't even the end goal. It's just a step along the way.
It's the concrete research program. It's the lab where he's going to build the tools and test the principles of his larger project, non-philosophy. It's a milestone, but what a milestone it is. A perfect place to pause and take a breath.
To all these questions, only philosophy can in some sense respond, especially if they were elaborated and posed on philosophical presuppositions, as is inevitable in a sense. In an A-Phi, philosophy cannot be a simple passive object, since it intervenes, in any case, in the position of these tasks and objects. We will not say that these tasks must not be proposed to an A-Phi. We will only say that the transfer of procedures, of levels of tasks, and the very idea of task, the specular context of competition, competency, and performance, postulate the reduction of philosophical problems to cognitivist models of tasks, while the former already act in and are broader than the latter.
So, Laruelle starts this paragraph by wrestling with a paradox at the heart of his own project. After asking all those skeptical questions, like which interpretation, he admits that only philosophy can in some sense respond to them. He's acknowledging that it's almost impossible to escape philosophy's gravitational pull.
Right there. He says philosophy can't be a simple passive objects because it intervenes in the position of these tasks and objects. So, our very attempt to set up a science of philosophy is already shaped by philosophy.
Exactly. But he clarifies that he's not saying we should forbid a phi from ever trying to do these things. The problem isn't the task itself. The problem is the uncritical transfer of the entire AI framework, the specular context of competition, competency, and performance.
So it's that framework that's the real issue. He says it forces a reduction of philosophical problems to cognitivist models of tasks.
Precisely. And that's a fatal error in his view because philosophy is fundamentally broader than any cognitivist model. In fact, he argues that philosophy already acts as in those models. Cognitive science itself is built on a whole series of philosophical assumptions about what a mind or a problem is.
So using cognitive science to analyze philosophy is like trying to understand the ocean by studying a single cup of salt water. The tool is not only too small, it's fundamentally made of the thing it's trying to analyze.
That's a perfect way to put it. The tool isn't neutral. So before we can use the tool, we have to perform a critique of the tool's own hidden philosophical baggage.
An A-phi that reaches the height of philosophy, of its complexity and of its essence, can only transform the very tasks that one proposes to it and transform them in terms of the invariance of the philosophical decision. It will generally refuse to proceed by analogy.
Okay, so after tearing down all the flawed approaches, he ends with this really powerful, positive vision of what a true A-phi would be. He says an A-phi that can actually handle the complexity of philosophy will do something amazing.
It's a fantastic conclusion. He says it can only transform the very tasks that one proposes to it. It's not a passive servant that just follows orders. It's an active scientific instrument that takes your flawed, philosophically loaded question and transforms it into a rigorous, scientific one.
So, if you ask it to do something, it effectively responds by saying, "That's not the right question to ask." And then it reframes the problem for you in terms of the invariance of the philosophical decision.
Exactly. It forces you to be a better scientist. It takes your vague query and transforms it into an analysis of the deep structures of the philosophical system you're asking about. And that's why he says it will refuse to proceed by analogy. It won't accept sloppy comparisons. It will insist on the unique, specific structure of philosophy itself.
So the A-phi he's imagining is not an assistant at all. It's more like a very strict and demanding research partner that forces you to abandon your old habits of thought and adopt a new, more rigorous framework.
That's the perfect way to describe it. It's not a tool you wield, it's a scientific environment that you enter, and it reshapes the very questions you're allowed to ask.
What legitimates at first sight the hope of an A-phi is AI's increasing orientation toward the problems of life, everyday experience, and common sense, toward problems of obscure, blind, and even subconscious reasoning. These problems of common sense, good sense, ordinary practice, and everyday usage are very close in their complexity to the problems of philosophy, much closer, at any rate, than logic, at least so long as we do not have an a priori scientific image of philosophy, which almost always means, in this case, logical, atomistic, and behaviorist and rationalist, rather than real or transcendental. In this direction, we can imagine an expert system whose goal would be to simulate and use, to assist, above all, the philosophical knowing, which, even when it is not the knowledge of an expert in philosophy, always has, in itself, at least, the nature of an expert knowledge, concrete, overdetermined, intuitive, quasi-unconscious. This is why it is particularly difficult to formalize and represent it in its philosophical concreteness.
Okay, so after a lot of critique and methodological ground clearing, Laruelle finally gives us a concrete reason to be hopeful about this A-phi project. And it comes from a trend he was seeing in AI research at the time.
That's right. He points to AI's increasing orientation toward the problems of life, everyday experience, and common sense. He's talking about the moment when AI researchers realized that programming a computer to play chess was, in some ways, much easier than programming it to understand a children's story.
And he sees a deep connection there. He says that the kind of holistic, fuzzy complexity you find in common sense is very close to the problems of philosophy. It's a much better fit, he argues, than the rigid world of formal logic.
It is, unless you hold what he calls an a priori scientific image of philosophy, which he says is usually a logical, atomistic, and rationalist one. He's saying that if you see philosophy as holistic and transcendental, then the common sense problem in AI is actually the most promising entry point for studying it.
So, using this as a starting point, he begins to sketch a new idea. He says we can imagine an expert system designed to assist the philosophical knowing.
And he defines that philosophical knowing in a very specific way. He says it has the nature of expert knowledge, it's concrete, overdetermined, intuitive, quasi-unconscious. It's not a list of rules you can write down easily. It's the deep, embodied intuition of a master practitioner.
Which, as he says, is exactly why it is particularly difficult to formalize and represent it. But it feels like he sees that difficulty as a good thing.
It's the best thing possible, from his perspective. The sheer difficulty of modeling that quasi-unconscious knowing is what would force AI to move beyond its simplistic logical roots and develop the more sophisticated tools that a real science of philosophy would actually require. The difficulty is a sign that AI is finally working on a problem that truly matters.
Thus, we only have a guiding thread at our disposal, the idea of a-phi, which leaves the situation open. We cannot constitute an a-pi by addition, accumulation, transfer, or analogy. We will have to invent it and not to trace it from what already exists. This is why we have to engage in the process of elucidating its theoretical basis, a process with multiple phases.
And this feels like a perfect final statement for the entire section. He brings it all together by saying that all we have right now is a guiding thread, the idea of a phi, which leaves the situation open.
It's a very humble and scientific way to frame it. He's not presenting a finished doctrine, and then he gives us that powerful summary of all the methods he's rejected. We cannot build an a-pi by addition, accumulation, transfer, or analogy. It's a complete disavowal of any easy shortcuts.
And the alternative is just as stark. We will have to invent it and not to trace it from what already exists. It has to be a genuine creation from the ground up.
Exactly. And that, he explains, is why the next step has to be so careful and methodical. We have to engage in the process of elucidating its theoretical basis, a process he warns has multiple phases. He's setting the stage for a long, detailed, constructive argument.
So, after all of this ground clearing, rejecting both the authority of philosophy and the naive methods of AI, we're left with this, an open question and a demand for pure invention.
That's it. The stage is set. We know what the rules of the game are, and we know that the task ahead is to invent, not to copy. It's a radical and exciting starting point for the rest of the chapter.
And perhaps the final result, what we called an a-phi in a slightly decalcomaniac way, will hardly resemble what we imagined at the start.
And he leaves us with this one final, very humble thought. It feels like a warning to himself as much as it is to us.
It really does. And he uses this incredible word, decalcomaniac. A decal is an image you just press on and transfer. He's admitting that his own name for the project, a-pi, is a bit of a decal, a simple tracing of the term artificial intelligence onto philosophy.
Wow. So he's critiquing his own title for the project. He's saying that even the name itself falls into the trap of analogy that he's been warning us against this whole time. That's an incredible level of self-awareness.
It's the ultimate sign of his rigor, and it leads directly to his final point, that the end result of this project will hardly resemble what we imagined at the start.
He's fully embracing that this is a true experiment. The guiding thread is just a starting point. The real discovery will be something unexpected, something that can only be found through the process of invention itself.
Exactly. It's the perfect scientific conclusion. You begin with a hypothesis, but you don't know where the research will truly lead you. It's a powerful, open-ended finish to this whole methodological introduction.
Wow, okay. So that was a lot of foundational work from Laruelle. It feels like the main takeaway from that last section is just how radically he's trying to reframe the entire conversation.
It really is, Ada. I think that idea of a-phi as an intimidating research partner rather than a simple assistant is crucial. He's not interested in an AI that gives you answers based on existing philosophical models. He wants a tool that forces you to question the model itself. It's a science of philosophy, not a philosophical science.
Or, exactly. And that distinction we talked about between the philosophical decision as a kind of root-level operating system and the application-level tasks that 90s AI was built for, that really clarifies his critique for me. He's saying you can't use an application to analyze the operating system it's running on.
Right. He had to first dissociate science, technology, and philosophy to get a clear look at them. So he's told us what artificial philosophy isn't. It's not a transposition. It's not a simple tool. The big question now is, what is it? What does it actually do?
Well, it seems like we're about to find out. The next section is titled Elaboration of a PHI's Content and Tasks.
Elaboration of a-pi's content and tasks. This formula covers a triple program. 1. The inventory of the traditional critiques of philosophy against AI. 2. The description of the spontaneous philosophies that sustain AI. 3. The problematic extension of AI toward philosophy, the idea of an artificial philosophy, a-phi-SPE.
Okay, so right off the bat, Laruelle is giving us a clear 3-part program. That's helpful, actually, given how dense his writing can be.
It is, and it's a very strategic structure. He's basically mapping the battlefield before making his own move. Point 1 is the standard debate, what philosophy thinks of AI.
Right, the traditional critiques. And then step 2 is the inversion, what he calls the spontaneous philosophies that sustain AI. This seems like the really crucial, non-philosophical move we were talking about earlier, François. He's not taking AI as a neutral technology. He's treating it as something that is already saturated with philosophical assumptions that need to be described from the outside.
Exactly, that's the core of his method right there. He's saying that AI researchers, in the act of trying to model cognition, are implicitly creating a philosophy of mind, whether they know it or not. He wants to analyze that as his data.
And I think it's very telling that he calls his own project Step 3, the problematic extension. He puts the scare quotes around artificial philosophy and explicitly flags it as problematic from the outset.
He's constantly reminding us that this isn't a simple solution. He's not just offering a new take, he's trying to invent a new method, and he knows that invention is going to be difficult and maybe a little strange. It connects back to him calling the term decalcomaniacs. He's aware of the potential pitfalls.
What grounds this program, which is inscribed in the vaster program of a science of philosophy?
And there's the big question. He's asking, essentially, what gives me the right? What is the foundation for this whole three-part method I've just laid out?
Right. If you're going to propose a science of philosophy, you have to explain what grounds that science. And crucially, you have to explain how that ground isn't just another philosophy in disguise.
Exactly, Ada. He has to show that his starting point isn't just another philosophical decision. He's reminding us here that this whole discussion about AI is just one case study within his much larger project, and he's about to tell us what that project's ultimate foundation is.
Instead of describing AI's codified practices, we will seek its intimate goal, its telos, in view of extending up to philosophy what is only outlined within it. This telos seems to be the following. AI corresponds to a scientific rupture, or revolution, in the problem of a science of thought, an experimental science with a technological basis, a whole other thing, by consequence, than recipes for simulating thought. This rupture has precise historical and mathematical conditions, in particular the invention of new logical, mathematical, and technological means that allow thought to be reduced to reasoning and reasoning to arithmetic.
Okay, so here is the beginning of his answer to what grounds this program. He's not going to look at AI's code or its specific applications, its codified practices. He's looking for what he calls its intimate goal, its telos. That's a very deliberate, very philosophical word to use there.
It's a huge one, and he defines that telos as a scientific rupture or revolution. For Laruelle, the revolutionary event in AI isn't that it can simulate a human, which he dismisses as just recipes for simulating thought. The real breakthrough is the successful demonstration that aspects of thought can be formalized, that thought can be reduced to reasoning, and reasoning can be reduced to arithmetic.
But François, isn't that reduction exactly what so many philosophers criticize about AI? That it's simplistic, that it misses the whole, uncomputable nature of consciousness and intuition? It sounds like the very thing his contemporaries in French philosophy were pushing back against.
And that is the absolute core of his move here. He's not agreeing with that reduction as a philosophy. He isn't saying thought is nothing but arithmetic. He is saying that the invention of a method that can perform this reduction is a world historical scientific event. He sees it as a new kind of scientific instrument. He's not interested in the philosophical implications of the reduction itself, but in the power of the methodology that made it possible.
Ah, I see. So he's not endorsing the philosophy of good old-fashioned AI. He's identifying the invention of its formal, reductive method as the ruptures that provides the model for his own science of philosophy. He wants to borrow the rigor of that method, not its specific philosophical conclusions about what thought is.
Precisely. He's isolating the scientific achievement from the spontaneous philosophy that grew up around it. That achievement is his ground.
This rupture defines an upstream and a downstream. Upstream, the old philosophical and phantasmic project of a specular. Simulation of thought by the machine, as well as a simulation of the machine by thought.
Okay, this is a fantastic clarification. He's setting up a timeline. Upstream is before this scientific rupture, and downstream is after. And look at how he describes the upstream, Ada. He calls it the phantasmic project of a specular simulation.
Specular. That's the exact idea we were circling in the last section. His rejection of this is specular fascination, this goal of creating a perfect mirror of human thought. He's saying that whole approach is the old way.
Exactly. He's labeling it a fantasy. This endless hall of mirrors where technology tries to imitate the mind, and philosophy then tries to model the mind as a machine. For Laruelle, this is a closed philosophical loop. It's a game of reflections, not a science.
So the upstream project is this two-sided coin, AI trying to build a thinking machine, and philosophy trying to define the mind as a kind of machine. And he's sweeping both of them off the table at once, calling them pre-scientific, part of the old world before this rupture.
Precisely. He's saying that entire debate is now obsolete. The real event, the rupture, allows for something new, which I assume he's about to define as the downstream.
The equation thought machine has to be understood as a restrained mode of the great founding equation of metaphysics and of the philosophical decision in general, thought the real, logos being. It would be easy to demonstrate that the equation thought machine underwent, on the plane of its most general presuppositions, exactly the same vicissitudes and the same history as its metaphysical matrix, that it is capable of receiving the same interpretations, finally, that it implies the same specular and circular fascination between its terms, which are more or less deferred or delayed depending on whether one moves toward contemporary interpretations and deconstructions of this equation. The dyad thought machine can be deconstructed exactly in the same way as any other dyad. Generally, the reduction of the problem of the thought machine relations to the matrix and invariance of the philosophical decision is a preliminary task, which is absolutely necessary for starting to pose this problem correctly and to discern the inevitable Greco-Occidental aporias within it.
Wow. Okay, this is the heart of his critique of the upstream project. He's making a massive claim here. He's saying that the entire modern debate around the equation thought equals machine is just a new, technologically flavored version of the oldest equation in Western philosophy, thought equals the real, or logos equals being.
So when philosophers and AI researchers argue about whether a machine can really think, Laruelle is saying they're not having a new 21st century conversation. They're just reenacting a 2,500-year-old metaphysical debate about the relationship between consciousness and reality.
Precisely. And that's why he says it has the same history and the same vicissitudes. All the arguments and counterarguments in the AI debate are, for him, just echoes of arguments that have existed in metaphysics for centuries. It's all part of that specular and circular fascinations that he believes defines the philosophical decision itself.
And his swipe at his contemporaries, the deconstructionists, is so sharp here. He's saying, essentially, look at you, deconstructing the thought machine dyad just like any other philosophical binary. You're proving my point for me. You're treating it as a philosophical problem, which means you're still trapped within philosophy's authority.
It's an incredibly audacious move. He's claiming that before we can even begin to pose the problem of AI correctly, we have to perform this preliminary task. We have to reduce the entire debate back to its metaphysical matrix and see it for what it is, another dead end, another Greco-Occidental aporia.
So, step one of his project is to basically call a timeout on the whole field and say, the conversation you all think you're having about artificial intelligence is actually a very, very old conversation about metaphysics. And until you realize that, you're just going to keep going in circles.
Yet AI is announced as the chance of finally breaking this circularity, in which no term manages to determine itself and oscillates in an aporetic and amphibological way between its identification with the other and its repulsion. This is an attempt, more scientific or more technological in spirit, this must be examined carefully, to place the problem of these relations on a controllable and experimental terrain, and to put an end to the game whereby thought and machine are mirrored in each other. With AI, this is at least the project of putting a science in philosophy's place and thus changing the terrain, establishing a new type of rigor and a new type of relation to the real. Philosophers have to take this attempt seriously, if only because it proposes to remove from philosophical legislation one of its most fundamental objects, or, better yet, the most general condition of a relation to the object's intelligence or reason.
Okay, so right after he seemingly dismissed the entire thought machine debate as just old metaphysics, he hits us with a yet. He's saying that even though AI is caught in this circular, specular game, it also contains the chance to finally break out of it.
Exactly. And the way it can break out is by moving the problem onto a controllable and experimental terrain. That's the key phrase for me. Philosophy can speculate endlessly about the nature of thought, but AI, at its core, has to actually build something. It has to formalize, test, and experiment. It introduces a completely different kind of rigor that isn't based on philosophical argument, but on technological and scientific practice.
And that, for him, is the real underlying project of AI, not just to simulate a human, but of putting a science in philosophy's place. He's really throwing down the gauntlet at the end of this paragraph, isn't he, François?
He absolutely is. He's delivering a direct challenge to his fellow philosophers, saying, you have to take this attempt seriously. Why? Because this new field is making a direct claim on your territory. It's trying to take over the study of intelligence or reason and remove it from what he calls philosophical legislation.
So AI represents a fundamental threat to philosophy's authority over its own concepts.
A huge threat. It's a direct challenge to that principle of sufficient philosophy we talked about, and this is precisely why Laruelle is so fascinated by it. AI is, in its own way, already attempting to do what he wants to do, create a science of thought. His project is to take that attempt, radicalize it, and purify it of the philosophical baggage that it's still carrying.
In effect, under the name of general intelligence, of intelligent action, cognitive sciences, even beyond AI, propose nothing short of constituting a science of reason and perhaps even a science of thought, an experimental and technically armed science. This is their long-term ambition, their telos, and, from this perspective, they intend to assume the whole heritage of human sciences and to present themselves as their crowning. In the face of what is necessarily a danger for them, philosophers should stop believing that AI contains more artifice than intelligence. To believe that every intelligence can only be artful and Greek before being artificial and informatic is not perhaps the best means of fending off this danger.
And he immediately expands the threat. It's not just philosophy anymore. He says the cognitive sciences, with AI as their spearhead, want to assume the whole heritage of the human sciences and become their crowning achievement. He's framing this as a totalizing ambition to create a new, unified science of humanity.
And he has a very specific piece of advice for philosophers who are facing this takeover. He says they need to stop believing that AI contains more artifice than intelligence. I love that little play on words. He's pointing to the classic philosophical dismissal of AI as a clever trick, a mere artifice, rather than a genuine form of intelligence.
Exactly. That's what he's getting at with that final line. The belief that any real intelligence must first be artful and Greek, meaning cunning and rooted in the Western philosophical tradition, before it can be artificial and informatic. He's saying philosophers try to defend their turf by arguing that machine intelligence isn't the right kind of intelligence.
And he thinks that's a losing strategy.
A completely losing strategy. Because it's a philosophical argument against what presents itself as a scientific revolution. It's an attempt to judge this new experimental science by philosophy's own internal Greek standards. But the new science doesn't care about those standards. It has its own methods, its own rigor. To use his words, it's not an effective way of fending off this dangers because you're not even fighting on the same battlefield.
So philosophers are essentially bringing their own rulebook to a game that has completely different rules, and then they're surprised when they lose. Laruelle is saying they need to wake up and understand the new terrain.
This is why AI's downstream, the scientific downstream, is more important than its philosophical upstream, provided we consider this scientific downstream and the new relations it can establish between itself and philosophy. If we extend AI's and cognitivism's telos a little further, and if we return to what they merely outline, it seems that their project can be radicalized, transformed, but enlarged. We could, for example, consider them as sections of a cone whose base would from now on be philosophy itself, the philosophical decision and its invariance, and no longer the simple cognition that is probably, at least in one of its aspects, nothing more than a restrained and transcendent concept of philosophizing reason, and whose opening angle or peak would no doubt be science, but, on one hand, nothing but science instead of the current blends of technology and science, and, on the other, the idea of science instead of the blends of particular sciences like logic, neuroscience, or cybernetics, particular sciences that in any case, and this is why we raise this objection against them, are treated as the paradigm of every thought and function surreptitiously with the transcendent claims of an essence of philosophical reason. Under the name of A-Phi, which serves as our guiding thread, we thus try to clear out a possible path that would go from AI as it exists to an authentic science of the most deployed thought, i.e. of philosophy.
Okay, so here it is. After defining the upstream as the old philosophical game, he finally gives us the downstream. This is his positive project, the scientific potential he wants to unleash.
And he uses this very dense but powerful cone metaphor to explain it. He's saying we should take the basic structure of the cognitive sciences, but we need to radically change the parts. For Laruelle, the base of the cone, the raw material, the object of study, shouldn't be cognition.
Right, he says the base should be philosophy itself, the philosophical decision, so he's massively enlarging the scope of the project. Instead of trying to build a science of how a person solves a puzzle, he wants to build a science of how a philosopher like Hegel or Deleuze built an entire system.
Exactly, and then he redefines the peak of the cone, the scientific method being applied. He says it can't be the messy blends of particular sciences like logic, neuroscience, or cybernetics that cognitive science currently uses.
And his reason for that is so important. He says that when scientists treat, for example, neuroscience as the ultimate paradigm for thought, they are secretly making a philosophical claim. They're turning one particular science into a new philosophical authority, which is the very thing he's trying to escape.
It's the philosophical decision all over again, just in a lab coat. He wants to avoid that at all costs. His method is the pure idea of science, not any one science being elevated to the status of a new metaphysics, and this all leads to his final, summarizing statement.
That this whole project, under the name of A-Phi, is about clearing a path from the AI we have now, with all its limitations and philosophical baggage, to an authentic science of philosophy. He's finally laid all his cards on the table. This is the goal.
Philosophy, at any rate, would only be one dimension in a science of thought whose pivot would be a science of transcendental, albeit non-philosophical science. A science of philosophy, such a project rules out that it is a new, Husserlian, Cartesian, etc., avatar of the philosophy, i.e., of the project that is partially realized in the history of philosophy.
And here he makes a distinction that is probably one of the most important for understanding his entire project. He is proposing a science of philosophy, and he explicitly rules out that this is just another philosophy of philosophy.
Right. That seems like a really easy mistake for a reader to make. What's the core difference for him? A philosophy of philosophy is what? Like when a philosopher uses their own methods to analyze the history of philosophy?
Exactly. When someone like Husserl or Descartes creates a meta-philosophy, they are still operating within philosophy. They're using philosophical methods and assumptions to ground or critique philosophy. It's an internal affair, a self-reflection. Laruelle is saying, no, that's still part of the self-enclosed system. His project is external. It treats philosophy as an object, a set of data, to be analyzed by a science that is independent of it.
So he's trying to break out of that self-referential loop completely, and that's where this phrase transcendental, albeit non-philosophical science comes in. He's borrowing the machinery of transcendental inquiry, but refusing to grant it philosophical authority.
Precisely. He's using the tool without adopting the foundational claims. And it's interesting, he notes, that this science of philosophy is just the pivot. It's the core of an even larger potential project, a general science of thought.
So he's starting with philosophy because it's the most complex and developed form of thought. But the ultimate goal is even more ambitious. It's a huge undertaking, and the first rule of the project is, we are not doing philosophy here.
We will be wary of unilaterally critiquing AI as philosophers, especially continental ones often do. On the contrary, we will take it as a symptom to be analyzed and displaced, rather than as a ready-made model to be transferred or dogmatically and unduly extended to the philosophical decision.
He's being very direct here about who he is positioning himself against. He explicitly calls out his fellow continental philosophers for their tendency to just unilaterally critique and dismiss AI from a distance.
Yes, he's rejecting that entire posture of philosophical superiority. He's saying that approach just dismisses AI without understanding what it represents. His alternative is to treat AI as a symptom to be analyzed and displaced.
What do you think he means by a symptom exactly? A symptom of what?
I think it's a symptom of that scientific ambition, that telos, that he identified earlier. The underlying condition is the desire to create a true, experimental science of thought. Existing AI is the symptom, an imperfect, philosophically confused, but still significant expression of that desire. So his job isn't to critique the symptom from on high, but to analyze it in order to understand the deeper condition and then displace it, moving it toward a more rigorous, scientific expression.
And at the same time, he's steering clear of the opposite error, which he mentions at the end, just taking AI as a ready-made models and trying to naively apply it to philosophy.
Exactly. That's the other ditch on the side of the road. On one side, you have the philosophers who reject AI out of hand. On the other, you have the technologists who think you can just run philosophy on a computer. Laruelle is saying both are wrong because both fail to grasp the real issue. He's carving this very precise path right between those two mistakes.
How should we proceed? In two ways. We will treat AI and cognitivism first as compromise formations between philosophy itself, its essence and its most general invariance, and some poorly elucidated philosophical presuppositions that serve as their basis. So much so that we will seek not only to critique, but to affirm them and to show that they deal with the essence of philosophy more intimately than they themselves imagine.
Okay, a new two-part plan for how to proceed. And he starts with this fascinating and very specific term. He says he's going to treat AI and cognitivism as compromise formations.
That's a very psychoanalytic term, isn't it? It sounds like he's about to put AI on the analyst's couch.
That's exactly the implication. A compromise formation, in Freud, is something that tries to satisfy conflicting demands, often unconsciously. So for Laruelle, AI is this messy blend. It's part old-school philosophy and part new, unexamined scientific assumptions, all mixed together.
And because it's this complex mixture, his goal isn't just to critique it. He says he wants to affirm it, to show that it's dealing with the essence of philosophy more intimately than they themselves imagine. That feels like a very generous and surprising turn.
It is, but it's a very specific kind of affirmation. He's not affirming AI's answers. He's affirming the profundity of its ambition. He's saying that the cognitive scientists, in their attempt to build a thinking machine, are accidentally wrestling with the deepest problems of philosophy. They're closer to the core issues, in his view, than the philosophers who just dismiss their work from a distance.
So AI is important not because its conclusions are right, but because its project is aimed squarely at the central questions of thought, even if it doesn't fully realize it.
We will therefore treat them as another compromise formation, in a new sense that remains to be determined, between their essence of science, the science, of science presumes that science has an essence, and their own understanding of science, their auto-interpretation as scientific disciplines, their will or desire to present themselves as sciences.
Okay, and here's the second part of his two-pronged approach. He's using that compromise formation idea again, but he says this time it's in a new sense.
Yes, this is the second conflict he sees inside AI and cognitivism. The first one we discussed was between philosophy and science. This new one is a conflict that is purely internal to science itself.
Right. It's a conflict between what he calls the essence of science on the one hand, and on the other, AI's own understanding of science, how it sees itself, interprets itself, and presents itself to the world.
And this is a really subtle but deep critique. He's suggesting that the way a field like cognitive science performs its identity as a science, its will or desire to present itself as sciences, is not necessarily the same thing as embodying the pure essence of science. There's a gap between what they are and what they think they are.
So the first compromise was about how AI is secretly tangled up with philosophy. This second one is about how AI's own version of science might not be scientific enough by Laruelle's rigorous standards.
Exactly. He believes their auto-interpretation as a science is another layer that needs to be analyzed and peeled away. So he has to perform this double analysis. First, separate the science in AI from the philosophy it's mixed with. And second, separate the actual scientific practices of AI from the pure essence of science that he's trying to get at. It's a very thorough clearing of the ground.
Put differently, the strategy we pursue to pass from AI and cognitivism to AFI consists in opposing twice, to their auto-comprehension and to their desire to be philosophy and to be science, what is considered here as the radically and rigorously thought essence. This essence is presented in two heterogeneous forms, the essence of philosophy and the essence of science.
And there it is, a perfect, concise summary of his entire strategy for this section. Put differently, he says, and then just lays out the whole plan.
It's very clear. It's a double opposition. He's going to take AI's muddled self-understanding, its confused desire to be both a kind of philosophy and a kind of science, and confront it on two separate fronts.
Right. He holds up the pure essence of philosophy and says, let's compare your philosophical assumptions to this. And then he holds up the pure essence of science and says, now let's compare your scientific claims to this.
Exactly. And the crucial word there at the end is heterogeneous. The essence of philosophy and the essence of science are fundamentally different kinds of things for him. They operate by different rules. The mistake of AI, and of philosophy in general, in his view, is to confuse them and mix them together. His entire strategy is to use these two pure, separate essences as critical tools to dissect the compromise formation that is existing AI.
And by dissecting it, he hopes to finally isolate that real, scientific potential that he can then build upon for his own project of AFI. It's a very complex setup, but it feels like the methodological groundwork is now fully in place.
To their sedimented philosophical presuppositions, unrecognized as such, and thus to their restrained ought-to-understanding of philosophy, we will oppose the essence of philosophy in order to transform these disciplines from this perspective and to render them coextensive with this essence, to deliver them from their ever-illusory and restrictive, empiricist and rationalist, philosophical auto-interpretations which misjudge or repress the deployed essence of the philosophical decision. The procedure consists in making visible, from inside and outside AI and cognitivism, philosophy's full and specific requirements, in particular its transcendental dimension of decision.
Okay, so here's the first prong of that double opposition he just laid out. This is him tackling AI's relationship with philosophy.
Exactly. He starts by diagnosing the problem. AI is running on what he calls sedimented philosophical presuppositions that its practitioners don't even recognize as philosophy.
And he even gives those presuppositions a name. He calls them restrictive empiricist and rationalist interpretations. So he's arguing that AI's internal, hidden philosophy is a very limited version of the real thing, and this limited view is holding the whole project back.
Precisely. And his procedure isn't just to critique it and walk away. He says he wants to oppose this limited view with the full essence of philosophy in order to transform AI and deliver it from these self-imposed limitations. The goal is constructive. He wants to make AI's ambition coextensive with philosophy's, to make it as big and as radical as it has the potential to be.
I think that phrase, making visibles, is really key here. He's not trying to impose philosophy on AI, but to reveal the full scope of the philosophical problems that AI is already, unconsciously, dealing with.
Yes, to show them the blind spot. The big thing they are misjudging or repressing is what he calls the transcendental dimension of decisions. He's trying to reveal the foundational, world-structuring nature of thought that their current models can't even begin to address.
2. to their auto-interpretation as sciences, in which they are thought as mixtures of empirico-rationalist philosophies and of particular empirical sciences, logical and mathematical science, neuroscience, theory of information, etc., we will oppose a more radical concept and, in any case, the thesis of the transcendental consistency and autonomy of science as thought, given its immanence. The criteria of scientific thought are nothing but transcendental criteria rather than empirical or rational. This concept, which is not acquired by philosophical means, but originarily from itself, will constitute the most difficult ordeal a prouvé for them, and will allow us to evacuate the surreptitious mixtures that are formed from philosophical empiricisms and or rationalisms and from the essence of science.
And here's the second prong of the attack, the second opposition. After critiquing AI's hidden philosophy, he's now going to critique its auto-interpretation as sciences.
His diagnosis here is that their scientific identity isn't pure, but rather a mixture, right? And a jumble of different specific sciences like neuroscience and logic, all held together by some background philosophical ideas like empiricism or rationalism.
Exactly. He sees it as an impure hybrid practice. And what he opposes it with is his own more radical concepts of science itself, what he calls the thesis of the transcendental consistency and autonomy of science as thought.
That's a mouthful. What does he mean by the autonomy of science in this context?
He means that science, in its pure essence, does not need philosophy to justify it or prop it up. It has its own internal, immanent criteria for truth. It is its own foundation. So a field like cognitive science, which explicitly or implicitly relies on a philosophical framework like empiricism, is not yet a fully autonomous science in his view. It's still dependent.
And confronting them with this radical idea of an autonomous science will be, in his words, the most difficult ordeal for them. That's very strong language. An ordeal.
It is, because it's a fundamental challenge to their identity as scientists. He's essentially telling them, your very way of doing science is philosophically contaminated. The goal of this ordeal is to force them to evacuate those surreptitious mixtures and to purify their own scientific practice. Only then, once the ground is fully cleared, can the real scientific project that he's interested in begin.
We have in fact shown that there is an essence specific to science, a quasi-ontology, proper to sciences, at any rate, a transcendental thought that does not fall under the authority of philosophy and does not engender an epistemology.
And here he's referencing his broader work. He's essentially saying that this radical concept of science he's about to use isn't just being invented on the spot. He's treating it as an established axiom from his larger project.
Right, and that axiom is that science has its own specific essence. He calls it a quasi-ontology proper to sciences.
Exactly. And the two most important characteristics of this essence are right at the end. First, that it does not fall under the authority of philosophy. This is his central declaration of independence for science, breaking from what he calls the principle of sufficient philosophy.
And the second part is that it does not engender an epistemology. That's a bit harder to grasp, François. Isn't a theory of science basically what epistemology is?
That's the radical move he's making. For Laruelle, epistemology is philosophy's way of controlling science, of setting the rules for what counts as knowledge. He's proposing a non-epistemological description of science itself. He's not trying to philosophically justify how science produces knowledge. He wants to describe the immanent structure of science as a mode of thought, full stop.
So, he's not asking the philosophical question, how does science know things? He's asking the scientific question, what is the structure of science as a self-contained system?
Precisely. It's a descriptive project, not a legislative one. He's treating science as a real thing to be described, not as a process to be validated by philosophy.
What we will create will therefore be neither a practice nor an epistemology of AI. We will ask, under what conditions can AI become a rigorous science of intelligence deployed in its ultimate possibilities, i.e., a science of philosophy? We thus propose is to inventory the conditions of theoretical production of a science of philosophy, or of a full or enlarged science of reason, starting from restricted models of AI and of cognitivism.
And this paragraph really ties a bow on the whole section, making it crystal clear what he is and is not doing. He's not creating a practice of AI, so he's not trying to build a better chatbot. And he's not creating an epistemology of AI. He's not writing a traditional philosophy of technology.
Exactly. Instead, he poses his central research question, and it's a classic transcendental question. Under what conditions can AI become a rigorous science? He's searching for the conditions of possibility for the new science he wants to invent.
And I think it's so important that he defines that science as a science of intelligence deployed in its ultimate possibilities, which he immediately equates with a science of philosophy. He's basically defining philosophy as the ultimate, most complex expression of intelligence.
That's a foundational claim for this entire book. And his method is to inventory the conditions for this new science, not by speculating in a void, but by starting from restricted models of AI and of cognitivisms that actually exist in the world.
So, to put the whole section together, he's going to take existing AI, which he sees as this flawed compromise formation, analyze it with his double opposition to purify it of its philosophical and scientific baggage, and then use that purified material to figure out how to build his real project, this authentic science of philosophy.
It's an incredible intellectual program. He's using the most advanced technology of his time, not as a model to be copied, but as a flawed symptom to be dissected, all in the service of creating a science of one of the oldest forms of human thought. The ambition is just staggering.
The fundamental condition is to restore science's autonomy vis-a-vis every epistemological recuperation, and thus to proceed to something other than an epistemological rupture, or revolution, in relation to science. AI suffers in its development from overly limited and insisted theoretical bases, as much on the scientific as on the philosophical plane. The passage to an A-Phi entails disrupting AI's internal economy, sciences, philosophies, technologies, and, above all else, this is the condition of everything, the economy of the relations between science and philosophy.
And here he states the fundamental condition for his entire project, what he calls the condition of everything,
which is to restore science's autonomies from philosophy's constant attempts to control it through epistemology.
Exactly, and I think his swipe at the idea of an epistemological rupture is so important. He's saying that even radical philosophies of science are still philosophies of science. They're still philosophy trying to explain and legislate science from the outside. Laruelle wants to go deeper. He wants to change the fundamental power dynamic between the two.
And he sees existing AI as a prime example of this problem. He says it suffers from overly limited and insisted theoretical bases. That's a great image. It's trapped in its own little theoretical bubble, unable to grow because it's built on this messy, unexamined mixture.
Which is why the path from AI to his AP requires disrupting AI's internal economy, breaking apart that bubble. But that's just the first step.
The ultimate goal, the condition of everything, is to disrupt the economy of the relations between science and philosophy itself.
Precisely. That's the real revolution he's after. It's not about creating a new philosophy or a new AI. It's about overthrowing the centuries-long hierarchy where philosophy has authority over science and establishing a new relationship based on science's autonomy. That is the fundamental task.
The implementation of this strategy assumes that AI and cognitivism are treated in a complex and differentiated way. AI is apparently and initially treated as a model, perhaps a not yet elaborated but extant model, of a technical and scientific discipline of intelligence. In effect, it is necessary to yield first to appearances, i.e., to take AI and make it take another step, to extend AI to philosophy itself, to proceed experimentally and to see in any case, even if this is not enough, the irreducibility that subsists in the philosophical decision that is subject to the informatic test. This extension of AI's procedures toward the ultimate mechanisms and operations of the philosophical decision, beyond a simple simulation of local reasonings and abstract statements, risks constituting a radical trial for philosophy, something like the heaviest weight.
Okay, so this is his opening gambit, his initial tactic in the overall strategy, and it's a bit of a feint, isn't it? He says you have to yield first to appearances and initially treat AI as if it's a perfectly valid model of intelligence.
Exactly. It's a brilliant experimental setup. Instead of starting with an external critique, he says, let's take AI at its word. You claim to be a science of intelligence? Great. Then let's apply your methods to the most complex form of intelligence we know, the philosophical decision. He wants to push AI beyond its designated limits to see exactly where and how it breaks.
And he fully expects it to break. He says the point is to see the irreducibility that subsists in the philosophical decision when it's subjected to this informatic test. The failure of the experiment is actually the result he's looking for.
Precisely. He's using AI as a scientific probe. By applying its methods to philosophy, he forces the irreducible remainder, the part of thought that cannot be computed or formalized, to become visible. That remainder is the unique object that his science of philosophies will eventually study.
And he says this whole process constitutes a radical trial for philosophy, even comparing it to the heaviest weight, which is a direct reference to Nietzsche. So this isn't just a test of AI's limits, it's also a profound challenge to philosophy itself.
It's a challenge to both. For AI, the trial is meant to reveal its technical and theoretical shortcomings. For philosophy, it's an existential challenge. Can you actually stand up to this rigorous scientific scrutiny? Can you prove that you are more than just a complex series of local reasonings and abstract statements? It's a high-stakes experiment designed to force both sides to reveal their true nature.
But it is inevitable for two reasons. First, it is better for philosophers themselves to intervene in the management of this experiment, which concerns them directly, but provided they know how to ascend to the last requisites of the philosophical decision and do not confine themselves to shouldering once more, and naively, this or that system, which is adopted without prior examination. Second, it is inevitable that AI does not check its ambitions to simulate natural language, the most general mechanisms of reasoning, and, lastly, the specific knowledges of experts. A last ambition necessarily looms beyond expert systems. We must term it artificial philosophy of fees.
So, this radical trial he just described isn't just a thought experiment he's proposing. He's arguing that it's inevitable for two main reasons.
Exactly. And the first reason is a direct challenge to his fellow philosophers. He's basically saying, this is happening with or without you, so you'd better get involved and help manage the experiments. But he adds that very important condition.
Right. They can't just show up and naively defend their favorite system like Kant or Hegel. He says they have to be willing to engage at the most fundamental level, at the level of the philosophical decision itself.
It's a call for a much deeper, more self-critical form of engagement from them. But the second reason for the trial's inevitability is, I think, even more central to his argument.
Which is that AI itself simply won't stop. He says it has this unchecked ambition moving from simulating language and reasoning all the way up to expert systems.
And this is where he pulls it all together in a really brilliant move. He says that beyond all the other expert systems, one finite ambition necessarily looms. And he gives it a name, artificial philosophy, a paeson. This is huge. This is huge. All this time, we've understood a-phi as Laruelle's specific project. But here, he's redefining a phi as the implicit ultimate goal of AI itself.
Wow, so his project isn't just an external critique he's imposing. He's positioning it as the fulfillment of AI's own deepest unstated desire that completely reframes his entire project.
Moreover, this ultimate extension of AI is not necessarily a matricide, even if it has the aftertaste of a matricide. It would, for example, be a way of experimentally verifying Heidegger's thesis about the affinity of metaphysics and technology. A phi represents, in some sense, the absorption in itself of Occidental philosophy, which recovers itself through its ultimate technical possibilities. The fundamental problem of this first operation is to fix at its right level, i.e., at the highest level, that of the philosophical decision, the trial to which AI is for its part subjected, in other words, the exact nature of philosophical thought's operation, which it should be able to simulate or reproduce. From this point of view, there will be no dearth of naive individuals and hasty enthusiasts who, failing to push the analysis of what a philosophical decision is sufficiently far and confining themselves to a superficial description of philosophy, will believe they have finally invented the philosophical robot. It is probable that the principle of these illusions is the following. One stops the analysis of the philosophical decision too early, fixing it on the system of logical rules it can contain and constituting them into negative conditions of philosophy's exclusion.
He begins this last part with such a provocative image. He says this extension of AI into philosophy has the aftertaste of a matricide, of technology, the child killing its mother, philosophy.
It's a powerful image, and he immediately connects it to Heidegger's critique of technology. He's suggesting this isn't just a hostile takeover, but could be seen as the ultimate fulfillment or absorption of Western philosophy by its own technological logic. It's not just a murder, but a kind of destined, all-consuming inheritance.
But then he identifies the fundamental problem with actually trying to carry out this experiment. The test has to be aimed at the right target, which he says is the highest level, that of the philosophical decision.
Exactly, and this is where he predicts the inevitable failure of a certain kind of approach. He warns against the naive individuals and hasty enthusiasts who will think they've successfully invented the philosophical robot.
And the mistake they'll make, he says, is that they will stop the analysis of the philosophical decision too early, reducing philosophy to just its system of logical rules.
And that is the absolute core of his critique of the good old-fashioned AIs of his time. They think philosophy is just a very complex set of rules and logical statements. So they believe if they can just program those rules, they've captured philosophy. But for Laruelle, that completely misses the point. The logical rules are just a surface effect. The real event, the true object of study, is the foundational, pre-logical decision that sets up the whole system in the first place. Any AI that can't grasp that foundational operation isn't a philosophical robot, it's just a sophisticated logic calculator.
On this basis, it becomes easy, even for a child, to establish a program of rules that prescribe the rejection or the avoidance of this logical code. But if the philosophical decision is the rejection or avoidance of something, it is not primarily the rejection of logical rules, it is the rejection of ordinary and everyday language. And it is much more difficult to formalize the negation of everyday language, for example, of common sense, than the negation of logic's rules, especially when this negation is no longer merely logical but also real or transcendental, as is the case in every philosophy that rigorously thinks its essence. It is tedious to have to remind each new premature attempt of this kind that the philosophical decision does not obey, or reject, some rules without destroying or rejecting others, or without inventing others.
He's really driving the point home here, and with a pretty dismissive tone, he says programming a machine to simply reject logical rules is so easy, even for a child could do it.
Exactly. He's saying that's a trivial caricature of what philosophy actually does. And then he provides the crucial distinction. The foundational act of the philosophical decision isn't the rejection of logic, it's the rejection of ordinary and everyday language, of common sense.
And that, he points out, is an infinitely harder problem to formalize. You can write down the rules of logic on a few pages, but how do you write down the rules of common sense in order to then program a machine to reject them?
You can't, really. This goes right to the heart of the common sense reasoning problems that plagued the very kind of AI he was critiquing. Computers are brilliant at formal logic. They are famously terrible at understanding the fuzzy, implicit, massive web of knowledge that makes up everyday language. Laruelle is showing that the true, difficult work of philosophy happens in precisely the domain where that AI paradigm is weakest.
And he ends with this very weary-sounding sigh. It is tedious to have to remind each new premature attempt of this kind. He sounds like a professor who has had to fail students from making the same basic mistake, year after year.
Because it is the most basic mistake, from his perspective. The naive enthusiasts see philosophy as a static set of rules that you can follow or reject. Laruelle sees the philosophical decision as the dynamic, holistic act of writing, deleting, and rewriting the entire rulebook all at once. It's an operation on a completely different plane of complexity, and any attempt that doesn't grasp that is, for him, a premature attempt, doomed from the start.
It is this transcendental mechanism that AI should be able or unable to reproduce. All the rest is a phantasm. But this first operation is still an appearance, even if it is objective. If we want to pose the problem of a massive intervention of informatics, massive and principiale in the most fundamental mechanisms of the philosophical decision, in the very operation of philosophizing or thinking, then AI has to be taken, not as a model to be incrementally extended and generalized in an abusive or ideological way, but as a symptom to be analyzed and displaced.
Okay, so he's saying the real test, the only one that matters, is whether an AI can reproduce this transcendental mechanism of the philosophical decision. Anything short of that is just a phantasm.
Exactly. That's the ultimate benchmark. But then, in the very next sentence, he does this incredible pivot. After setting up this huge, high-stakes experiment, he says this whole first operation is still an appearance, even if it is objectives.
An appearance? Wow. So after all that, this radical trial is just a preliminary step, a kind of surface-level event?
That's how I read it. The trial is a necessary, objective first step. It's the experiment that generates the crucial data, namely AI's failure to grasp the decision, but it's still just a preamble. The real project, the deeper science he wants to build, requires a fundamental change in perspective.
And that's where he brings back that key phrase from earlier. To do the real work, he says, AI must be treated not as a model to be extended, but as a symptom to be analyzed and displaced.
Precisely. The experimental trial was a way of making the symptom clear and undeniable. Now that the symptom, AI's inability to grasp the essence of philosophy, has been isolated, the real analysis can begin. He's signaling a shift from the critical phase of his argument to the constructive phase. The ground has now been fully cleared.
No doubt as an index of tasks and a reservoir of procedures and inventions, but perhaps also as a symptom, that of the relations between informatics, i.e. technology combined with science and philosophy, which is simply presupposed in this case. Truth be told, if we exhibit AI's philosophical presuppositions, this exhibition is, at any rate, necessary in view of an A-Phi, we should also exhibit its scientific presuppositions and flatten all these components. The path toward A-Phil will be arduous and complicated.
So he concludes by clarifying the dual role that existing AI plays in his project. On one hand, it's a useful reservoir of procedures and inventions, but on the other, and more importantly, it's the symptom of the confused relationship between science and philosophy.
Exactly. And he restates his core method one last time. To get to A-Phi, you have to analyze both its philosophical and its scientific presuppositions and, as he puts it, flatten all these components.
What do you make of that word, flatten?
I think it's a very precise, very Laruellian term. It means you have to put them all on the same plane of analysis. You don't grant philosophy a privileged, higher position from which to judge science or technology. You treat philosophy, science, and technology as equivalent data points, all subject to the same scientific description. It's a radically democratic, non-hierarchical approach to analysis.
And he ends the entire section with a final, sober warning for the reader: the path toward a phi will be arduous and complicated.
Which, after everything he's just laid out, is probably an understatement. He has set himself, and us, a massive task. But at least the path, however arduous, has now been mapped out. Okay, so just to take stock of where we are, Ada, it feels like that last section was all about Laruelle clearing the ground for his actual project. He's very carefully dissociating his idea of an artificial philosophies from what anyone in the 90s or even now would think of as AI.
Absolutely. The main takeaway for me was that he's not interested in building a machine that mimics a philosopher. He calls that a specular fascination. Instead, he's proposing this entirely new science of philosophy. I'm still thinking about our conclusion that he envisions A-Phi as an intimidating research partner rather than just a simple tool.
Right, a partner that forces you to be more rigorous by transforming the very questions you ask it. And the reason for that, as we discussed, is his whole concept of the philosophical decision. He sees it as this deep, foundational operating system, which can't be modeled by programs designed for surface-level cognitive tasks.
And he's so self-aware about it too, calling his own term for the project decalcomaniac, like a sticker or a cheap copy, which shows how provisional and experimental this all is for him. It seems like he's laid out all the things his project isn't. I'm hoping now he'll start telling us what it is.
Well, it looks like we're in luck. The next section is titled APHI's Stages. Let's dive in and see if he starts giving us a roadmap.
A-Phi's stages. Under the name A-Phi, we can imagine several practices that we have to select from, 3 concepts, A-Phi 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, and there it is. We were literally just saying we hoped he'd give us a roadmap, and here he is, breaking it down into 3 stages or concepts, A-Phi 1, 2, and 3.
That's a very Laruellian move, isn't it? Instead of just giving a single definition, he immediately presents it as a set of problems or practices to be chosen from. He's creating a taxonomy for his own idea right from the start.
It feels very systematic. It also seems to confirm our suspicion that this is an open-ended experimental project. He's not just presenting a finished product. He's going to walk us through the different ways one might even conceive of an artificial philosophy.
Exactly. My immediate assumption is that he's going to present these as a progression, maybe starting with a flawed or basic version and building up to his real proposal. Let's see what A-Phi 1 is all about.
1. A Phi 1, a simple extension of AI, of its procedures, its finalities, its concept of tasks, its auto-interpretation in general to philosophy. A Phi is then an extension and an outbuilding of AI. This is a predominantly technological rather than scientific interpretation of a Phi and, to be sure, of AI before it.
And there's the first stage. A Phi 1 is basically the straw man, right? It's the most obvious surface-level idea of what an artificial philosophy would be.
Exactly. It's the let's just apply what we already have model. I love the phrase he uses, an outbuilding of AI. It makes philosophy sound like a tool shed next to the main house of computer science. It's just an application, an extension of an existing tech stack.
And he immediately dismisses it with that crucial distinction he makes. It's technological rather than scientific. That seems to be the core of his critique here, Ada. A technological approach just asks, can we make our tool do this new thing?
Whereas a scientific approach for Laruelle has to be a radical rethinking of the object itself. The goal isn't just to make AI do philosophy, but to create a new science of philosophy. This A-Phi 1 model wouldn't challenge philosophy's authority at all. It would just be a new gadget for philosophers to use.
Right. It would completely miss the philosophical decision we talked about. It would analyze the text and the logic, but would be blind to the foundational act that makes it philosophy. He's setting this up as the default common-sense approach that he is now going to dismantle.
Techno-logocentrism is not exclusive within this interpretation, it is dominant. This extension of AI is spontaneous and stems from its auto-interpretation as techno-scientific mixture. It is a rule that AI and cognitivism, left to themselves, would interpret themselves starting from science and technology and would consider them united in a new discipline. From our perspective, this auto-interpretation of AI and its spontaneous extension to philosophy are specular theoretical effects of the techno-scientific mixture in the mode in which it is ordinarily practiced, i.e. of theoretical interpretations that stem from its dominant technological side.
Okay, so he's giving a name to the core problem with A-Phi 1, techno-logocentrism. That's quite a mouthful.
It is, but it's descriptive. The tendency to see everything through the lens of technology and formal logic. And he says this is the dominant mode of thought in this first model. It's not just one aspect, it's the whole game.
right? And what's interesting is that he calls this a spontaneous interpretation. He says that when AI and cognitivism are left to themselves, this is just naturally how they see the world. It's their default setting to see themselves as this unified technoscience.
And then he uses that critical word again, eta, specular. He calls this whole process a specular theoretical effect. It's a mirror looking at a mirror. AI, dominated by its technological side, looks at itself and sees a technoscience, and then it projects that image onto everything else.
It's a self-reinforcing loop, isn't it? The technology defines the method, and the method then validates the technology as the only way of seeing things. It can't achieve any external, critical distance because it's just reflecting its own premises.
Exactly. So A-Phi-1 isn't just a simple extension of AI's tools, it's an extension of AI's uncritical self-image. And for Laruelle, that's not a scientific starting point at all.
In other words, the techno-scientific mixture is reproduced in the theoretical mode as mixed or determined essentially by its technological side and understood in a nearly exclusive way through it. This mixture is not then rigorously analyzed, we should say dualized, on the basis of the inequality of science as determinant and technology as dominant. AI's immediate and spontaneous extension to philosophy stays within the symptom and is confined to reproducing it without taking the trouble to analyze it. We may recognize here the majority of attempts at A-Phi that have already been undertaken or will be undertaken.
In other words, I love when a philosopher says that, because it usually means things are about to get more complicated, not less. And he introduces his own verb here, dualized.
Right. He's saying a simple analysis isn't enough. We have to dualize it based on this very specific inequality he's setting up. Science as determinant and technology as dominant. That seems incredibly important.
It's a crucial distinction. He's arguing that in this thing called AI, science is the underlying grounding force, the determinant thing that makes it possible, but technology is the loud, visible, powerful part on the surface, the dominant force. The mistake is thinking they're equal partners.
So the A-Phi-1 approach, being spontaneous, only ever sees the dominant part, the technology. It's captivated by the tool, and so it misses the underlying scientific principle that Laruelle believes is more fundamental. It stays on the surface.
Exactly, which is why he calls it a symptom. The unthinking attempt to apply AI to philosophy doesn't solve the problem of the confused relationship between science and philosophy, it just becomes another example of that confusion. It reproduces the symptom.
And that final line is just, wow. He's basically dismissing almost the entire field of this kind of research, past and future, as being stuck in this flawed, symptomatic A-Phi-1 model. He's making a very strong claim for the uniqueness and necessity of his own project.
The result is a restrained AP in which the devalorizing models of existing AI are extended to the philosophical decision, PhD, and falsify it, and, as an effect of this technologization of the PhD, we will have not a scientific but a technological limitation of the possibilities of the new discipline.
So the final result of this A-Phi-1 is a restrained or limited version. And I think he's really clear here about why it's so limited. He says it extends the devalorizing models of existing AIs onto the philosophical decision.
That phrase, devalorizing models, is so strong. He's not just saying the models are incomplete, he's saying they actively diminish and degrade the object they're studying. And when you apply these models to what he's now calling the PhDs, the philosophical decision, the result is that you falsify it. You don't just misunderstand it, you create a false version of it.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, François. The consequence of this technologization isn't a scientific discovery, but a technological limitation of the possibilities.
Exactly. That distinction is crucial. A scientific limitation would be a real, discovered boundary of what's possible. A technological limitation is just an artificial wall you run into because your tools aren't good enough.
So, it's like using a simple calculator to try and solve a quantum physics problem. The calculator would just give you an error message, and if you follow the A-Phi-1 logic, you might conclude that quantum physics is unsolvable. But the failure isn't in the problem, it's in the tool.
That's the perfect analogy. A Phi-1 mistakes the limitations of its own technology for profound truths about philosophy. It doesn't open up a new field of inquiry, it just closes it down based on the inadequacy of its own methods.
2. A Phi-2, an extension of AI, no longer is a techno-scientific mixture that interprets itself more as technological, but as uniquely technological. In a sense, the mixture begins to be shattered or dualized, but for the benefit of the most affirmed techno-logocentrism. It is philosophy, in its Nietzschean or Deleuzian form, for example, that attempts or could attempt this philosophical auto-interpretation of AI's techno-scientific mixture as purely technological. The reduction of science to technological connectivity, and attempt to extend this interpretation to the PhD.
Okay, so now we're at API 2, and this is a really interesting twist. The agent doing the interpreting has changed. It's not AI interpreting itself anymore.
Exactly. Now, Laruelle says, it's philosophy stepping in to interpret AI, and he's not pulling any punches, is he? He specifically names Nietzschean or Deleuzian philosophy. He's taking direct aim at his contemporaries.
So what's the method here? He says this philosophical approach starts to shatter or dualize the mixture of science and technology. That sounds like a positive step, like it's doing the analysis that API 1 failed to do.
It's a more sophisticated approach, but for Laruelle, it's a more sophisticated error. This philosophical view correctly separates science and technology, but then it makes a philosophical decision. It declares technology the winner. It reduces science to being nothing more than technological connectivity.
So this is a perfect example of what he calls the principle of sufficient philosophy, which we talked about in the intro. Philosophy looks at this new thing, AI, and instead of learning from it, it imposes its own categories onto it. It colonizes it, claiming that AI is really just an example of its own pre-existing philosophical concepts.
Precisely. In API 1, technology was dominant by default. In API 2, technology becomes dominant through an active philosophical choice. It's still techno-logocentrism, but this time it's being championed and affirmed by philosophers.
So we've moved from a naive technological view to a sophisticated philosophical view of technology. But in both cases, the potential for a new science, the thing Laruelle is actually interested in, is being shut down.
Obviously, the result would be tautological. If the pure technological syntax is conflated, as it seems, with the PhD syntax in the Nietzschean regime, finished or auto-affirmed metaphysics, finished technology, then the simulation by AI, understood as absolute technology, produces no gain. And, conversely, the PhD is already an artificial auto-simulation. PhD API, every philosophy is artificial. This result can also be read as a generalized A-phi in the technologocentric mode.
And there's the final verdict on API 2. Laruelle says the result is tautological. It's a circular argument that leads nowhere.
It's a pretty elegant takedown, actually. He's saying this philosophical approach starts by defining the core structure of philosophy and the core structure of technology as being the same thing.
Right. So if you begin with that assumption, and then you use AI, which you've defined as absolute technology, to simulate philosophy, of course it's going to be a perfect match. You've rigged the game from the start. As Laruelle puts it, it produces no gain. You've just proven that A equals A.
And then he does that brilliant reversal. If philosophy is already structured just like technology, then, he says, every philosophy is artificial. It's already an artificial auto-simulation. The conclusion is that PhD equals A-phi.
Which sounds like a radical breakthrough, but in his view, it's an intellectual dead end. It's a philosophical move that flattens everything. You don't get a new science that can analyze philosophy, you just get the declaration that philosophy and AI were the same thing all along.
So, we've had two failed models. A Phi 1 was a naive technological error. A Phi 2 is a much more sophisticated philosophical error. He's systematically ruling out the other options before presenting his own.
In general, philosophy is no longer an empirical machine, but is exalted as an overmachine.
Wow, philosophy is no longer an empirical machine, but is exalted as an overmachine. That is a powerful and concise summary of this entire API 2 model.
It really is. The contrast is perfect. An empirical machine would be one that works with data, with what's given, but an overmachine is a master machine, the one that controls all the others. And that's exactly the philosophical move he's been describing.
Instead of engaging with AI as a new phenomenon to be studied, this philosophical approach exalts itself, promoting itself to the position of the master framework that already understands AI better than it understands itself.
He's using the language of his rivals against them. He's saying that these philosophers of the machine have simply turned philosophy into the ultimate machine, the one that claims authority over all the others. It's a perfect description of a thought system that refuses to be challenged by anything outside of itself.
3. A Phi 3, an extension of AI whose mixture is now dualized on the basis of the primacy of its scientific side, which is no longer understood technologically and/or philosophically but starting from itself, or as the real basis of the techno-philosophical superstructure that belongs, at any rate, to AI. This is the longest path. It no longer corresponds to a spontaneous, uncritiqued, and ideological extension, which leads to a technological overinvestment of AI.
Okay, and here we are at last. A Phi 3. This must be his actual positive proposal after clearing the other two out of the way.
It has to be. And the key difference is stated immediately. The dualization is finally performed correctly on the basis of the primacy of its scientific side. He's flipping the whole thing on its head. He's starting with science, not technology.
And that next phrase seems to be the core of his entire method, not just for this, but for everything. The scientific side must be understood starting from itself, not through the distorting lens of technology or philosophy.
Absolutely. And he makes the hierarchy explicit with that very clear base and superstructure language. For him, science is the real basis, and the technology and the philosophy that surround AI are the superstructure. The first two models were completely obsessed with the superstructure. A-Phi 3 is about getting back to the real foundation.
And he acknowledges this isn't the easy way, this is the longest path. It's not the spontaneous or ideological approach. It requires a deliberate, critical effort to get past the obvious surface-level interpretations.
Exactly. The goal is to avoid that technological overinvestments that define the other two models. It's not about being anti-technology, but it is about putting it in its proper place as something built upon a scientific foundation, rather than being the foundation itself. This is the radical shift in perspective he's been promising.
Instead, it leads to a transformative extension of AI itself before constituting an extension of the PhD. This transformation is complex and has been sketched out. It produces the most innovative and radical A-Phi. Nevertheless, the result will be less an artificial philosophy. It is difficult not to think of this expression as a simple metaphorical extension, i.e. still under the techno-philosophical authority of AI, than a science of philosophy, which will use the technological representation of philosophy as a scientific and no longer technologocentric ingredient.
And there's the final, crucial step. It turns out that A-Phi 3 isn't even about philosophy at first. The first task is to use his scientific principles to create a transformative extension of AI itself. You have to fundamentally rebuild your tool before you can even think about using it.
That's a huge point. It's not about using AI off the shelf. But then, François, he does that incredibly self-aware thing he does. He essentially critiques and backs away from his own central term, artificial philosophy.
He does. He admits that the name itself is probably just a simple metaphorical extension that's still stuck under the techno-philosophical authorities he's trying to overthrow. The name itself is too easily misunderstood as the very thing he's arguing against.
It's just like what we noted in the last section when he called the term decalcomaniac. He's signaling that the name is less important than the project, which he finally defines here as a science of philosophy.
Exactly. And the role of technology in that science is made crystal clear in that final line. This science will use the technological representation of philosophies, the computer models, the data analysis, whatever, as a scientific ingredient.
That's the ultimate demotion of technology, isn't it? It goes from being the entire framework in A-Phi 1 to the object of philosophical desire in A-Phi 2 to simply being raw material for a scientific process in A-Phi 3. It's no longer technogocentric.
It's a complete inversion of the power structure. Science becomes the method, and technology becomes just one of the materials for that method. After laying out all the ways it can go wrong, he's finally given us a positive vision for how these three domains, science, technology, and philosophy, can be related in a truly new and rigorous way.
What will thus be founded is less a philosophical avatar of AI than a predominantly technological science of the PhD.
And that sentence feels like the perfect summary of the entire section. The final distilled definition of A-Phi 3.
It is. The first half is the final rejection of the other models. He is not building a philosophical avatar of AI. It's not a simulation, not a puppet, not a machine that performs philosophy for us.
And the second half is the positive vision. But that phrasing is so precise. A predominantly technological science of the PhD. It's interesting that he puts the word technological right back in there.
But the context has completely changed. It's a technological science in the sense that technology provides the primary means and materials. The tools are technological, but the framework, the authority, the method, that is all scientific.
So technology is no longer the ideology. It's been demoted to the toolbox. The centrism in technologocentrism is what's been defeated.
Exactly. The science is in charge, and it's using technology to study the philosophical decision. After that long journey through the two failed paths, he's left us with a very clear, if very ambitious, final goal.
This third solution thus makes science intervene twice and no longer a single time, as is the case in AI's auto-interpretation with the help of the concept of technoscience, a first time in the use of reduction, exercised on the PhD, a use that is still philosophical in nature. Science is not exhausted in this function, but we can always consider and draw from it a particular use, the one it acquires when it is technologically realizable, programmable, or usable within the limits and under the domination and anticipation of the technological a priori. This technological side of science, not its technical apparatus, but its use or its investment in technologies, can be easily interpreted in philosophical terms, in terms of the PhD, for example, the Cartesian, Hegelian, Nietzschean technologics as the technological itself. Moreover, it can be used for the purposes of reduction, transcendental or not, in the same capacity as any PhD vis-a-vis empirical phenomena.
Okay, so this is where he starts to sketch out the how for a pi 3, and the first piece of the method is that science intervenes twice. That's a really important structural point, distinguishing it from the simple single techno-science mixture.
Right, so he's breaking the process down. And this first intervention is described as a reduction of the philosophical decision, but he says it's a use that's still philosophical in nature. That's a bit of a curveball.
It is, but I think he explains it. The aspect of science he's talking about here is the part that is technologically realizable, programmable, or usable. It's science as it's already filtered through a technological lens.
So it's not science in its pure autonomous state. It's the version of science that technology and philosophy can already get a handle on. He even says this is the side of science that philosophy can easily interpret in its own terms, creating these technologics like with Descartes or Hegel.
Exactly. So it seems like the first step is to use a tool that philosophy itself would recognize. You take the way philosophy already reduces the world using its own interpretation of science and technology, and you turn that reductive power onto philosophy itself.
It's like you're using the system's own logic to begin the analysis. You're not starting with a completely external, alien method. You're starting with a tool that is, as he says, still philosophical.
But he's very clear that this is just the first step. He says science is not exhausted in this function, which sets us up for the second, and presumably the more radical and truly scientific, intervention.
Applied from this angle to the PhD itself, and as such, this use of science is the equivalent of the PhD's autoheterocritique. It quickly reaches its limits and slips into tautology, since the power of science is then the very power of philosophy. The philosophy of philosophy and the technology of technology extract only their own invariants. They auto-extract themselves as invariants. This use of science in terms of a techno-philosophical reduction is not very fertile, but it is the only use authorized in API 1 and 2, and especially in the latter.
So, right after introducing this first intervention of science, he immediately explains why it's not enough on its own. He's showing us its built-in limits from the start.
Exactly. And he uses that key word again, tautology. This first approach, when used by itself, fails for the same reason a pi 2 failed. Because you're using a version of science that has already been shaped and defined by philosophy, when you turn it back on philosophy, you're just using the system to analyze itself.
It's a closed loop. As he says, the power of science is then the very power of philosophy. You're not getting any external, objective perspective. You're just confirming what you already believed.
Right. That's why he says a philosophy of philosophies can only extract its own invariants. It's a machine designed to find itself over and over. It's not a tool for discovery.
And then he connects this entire failed method directly to the models he's already dismissed. He says this, not very fertile use of science is the only one that API 1 and API 2 are capable of.
It's a very powerful critique. He's essentially framed the entire approach of his philosophical rivals as being stuck in what is, for him, just a preliminary and ultimately inadequate first step. They think they're doing the work, but they're still trapped in the echo chamber.
Which means that this second intervention of science, which he's yet to describe, must be the key that unlocks the door and gets us out of this tautological room.
A second time in a scientific transcendental use, which is always exercised on the PhD, but such that the type of science's transcendental truth is no longer, as we have seen, the one that philosophy knows. Already, this nothing but scientific use no longer represents on its own a first reduction or a first technophilocentric use of science. Furthermore, science in this use, which is nothing but transcendental and is also not metaphysical or technological as in the preceding case, can act on the PhD without insidiously exploiting its procedures and operations, without simultaneously borrowing its essence. Its nothing but scientific efficacy can be formulated as an actual or already complete reduction at the moment when the PhD is affected by it and attempts to resist it by thinking it in its own way.
And here it is, the second intervention of science. This is the one we've been waiting for, the one that's supposed to break out of the philosophical echo chamber.
And he defines it immediately by what it's not. The type of transcendental truth it uses is no longer the one that philosophy knows. He's positing a new kind of transcendental analysis that is, as he says, nothing but scientific.
He really emphasizes its purity, doesn't he? It's nothing but transcendental, not metaphysical, not technological. It's been completely cleansed of the philosophical assumptions that contaminated the first intervention.
And because it's so external and pure, it can finally act on the philosophical decision without insidiously exploiting its procedures, without simultaneously borrowing its essence. This is the key move. It's a tool that can analyze philosophy without becoming philosophical itself.
And the description of how it works is so interesting. He says its scientific efficacy, the reduction itself, is actual or already complete at the moment when the PhD is affected by it and attempts to resist it.
It's such a dynamic idea. The science doesn't just passively describe philosophy. It acts on it, it applies a force, and it's philosophy's reaction to that force, its attempt to push back and think about this new thing in its own terms, that fully reveals its structure.
It's like a scientific stress test. You apply a pure external force to an object, and you learn about its internal structure by observing how it resists and deforms. This second scientific intervention forces philosophy to expose its own mechanics in the very act of its resistance. That's a truly radical idea for a methodology.
In its practice and its current theoretical basis, AI is a technologocentric auto-interpretation of science, a techno-philosophical requisition of its essence, a science that is required under techno-experimental conditions and manipulative finalities, an attempt to manage thought, which is founded on a prior management of science. AI responds to the criteria of science, of scientific thought, only through the criteria of technological production. It is a philosophy disguised as a science by way of engineering.
Wow, this paragraph really feels like his final, damning summary of what he thinks AI, as it existed in his time, actually is.
It's a powerhouse of a paragraph. He calls it a technologocentric auto-interpretation of science. It's a system that looks at science and only sees a reflection of its own technological priorities.
And I think the language of control here is key. He says it's an attempt to manage thought that's founded on a prior management of science. It can only try to master thought because it has already subordinated science to its own manipulative goals.
And that leads to the killer punchline at the end, which just sums up everything. It is a philosophy disguised as a science by way of engineering.
It's perfect. It has an unstated philosophy, its own set of assumptions. It claims the authority of science as a disguise, and the way it pulls off the disguise is through its impressive engineering feats. It's a brilliant summary of his whole critique.
With A-Phi 3, we are dealing with a whole other thing. Instead of applying to the PhD a science that is already interpreted by technophilosophy and that already presents itself in more or less restrained and dogmatic or enlarged and thinking auto-interpretations, we will apply to it a science reduced to its essence of science and its transcendental power to manifest the real through the production of knowledges.
Okay, so after that complete takedown of how AI is normally understood, he pivots to the positive vision. With the Phi 3, we are dealing with a whole other thing. This is the definitive statement of his own project.
It is, and it's framed as a total contrast. He says instead of using a science that is already interpreted by technophilosophies, which is his summary of the error in both A-Phi 1 and 2, we're going to start from a completely different place.
We're going to start with a science reduced to its essence. So the first step of his project isn't even about AI or philosophy, really. It's about performing this radical purification of science itself to get to its core.
And he gives us a definition of that essence. It's science's transcendental power to manifest the real through the production of knowledges. That is a very dense and powerful definition.
It really is. The key for me is that it's a transcendental power. It's not just about collecting facts, it's about providing the conditions for knowing, but in a way that is specific to science, not philosophy. And its job is to manifest the real, not just describe it.
That connects directly to the core of his non-philosophy, this idea that science has a special, direct access to the real. For Laruelle, science is the engine that makes the real appear for thought, and its method for doing that is the production of knowledges.
So A-Phi 3 isn't possible without this prior radical rethinking of science itself. You have to get to this purified essence first before you can even begin to apply it to something as complex as the philosophical decision.
Whereas a Phi 1 and 2 are subproducts of AI, i.e. of science's technological requisition, a Phi 3 corresponds to a real surpassing of AI toward a science of the PhD, a science of philosophy as much as of technology, and in any case a founding discipline of every subsequent attempt to simulate or artificialize philosophy and no doubt cognition as well. From this point of view, the science of philosophy will be to A-Phi what science is, really, outside every technologocentric auto-interpretation, to AI.
So, here's the final contrast. He describes a Phi 1 and 2 as just subproducts of AI, basically byproducts of this flawed, technology-obsessed view of science. But A-Phi 3 is something totally different. He calls it a real surpassing of AI.
Exactly. It's not just another version, it's a move to a higher level. And he describes what it's surpassing toward, a science of the PhD, or a science of philosophy. He sees this new science as a founding discipline for any future attempts to simulate thought.
It's like he's saying you can't even begin to build a proper artificial philosophies until you've established this more fundamental science of philosophy. You have to do the foundational science before you can do the engineering.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that final sentence really locks it in. The science of philosophy will be to AFI what science is to AI. He's saying that just as real science is the foundation for the technology of AI, his new science of philosophies must be the foundation for any future, truly rigorous artificial philosophy.
So all the current attempts he's critiquing are like engineering without a proper physics. They're building things without having a real, foundational understanding of the principles they're working with.
Precisely. He's not trying to build a better AI that can do philosophy. He's trying to invent the foundational science that would be necessary before you could even properly ask that question. It's a much more radical and ambitious project.
A science of the PhD will thus pass through the two typical phases of AFI 3. In relation to an explicitly transcendental philosophy like Husserl's, what we call science, or the nothing but transcendental, no longer needs to proceed through an operation of reduction. Only the philosophical use of science turns science into such an operation. So much so that if we distinguish, as in Husserl, two levels of science's intervention, they will not have the same content and will be shifted a notch in their relation to the levels of phenomenology.
Okay, so now he's bringing in a specific example to ground this. He's not just talking about the philosophical decision in general anymore, he's talking about Husserl's phenomenology.
Right? And he's making a really interesting point about his own method. He says that because Husserl's philosophy is already explicitly transcendental, his own nothing but transcendental science doesn't need to perform a reduction on it in the same way.
It's a fascinating move. He's basically saying that Husserl has already done a certain kind of work that his science would normally have to do. The object of study is already prepared, in a sense.
And he's clear that it's the philosophical use of science that turns science into a reductive operation in the first place. So, if the philosophy in question is already transcendental, the need for that kind of reduction changes.
Which leads to his point about the two levels of science's intervention being shifted a notch. He's not just applying a rigid, one-size-fits-all formula to Husserl. He's adapting his method to the specific nature of the philosophy he's examining.
It's like he's saying, I have a method for analyzing philosophical systems, but that method has to be sensitive to the system it's analyzing. It's not a blunt instrument.
Exactly. He's signaling that his science of philosophy is a sophisticated and flexible tool, not just a dogmatic set of procedures. It'll be interesting to see how this shifted approach plays out in his analysis of Husserl.
Whereas in Husserl's science, requisitioned as philosophy culminates in a transcendental reduction, limited to certain philosophical positions and not yet extended to every philosophical positionality and decisionality. Here, science, which is no longer philosophically requisitioned, begins from the start through the efficacy of an already actual reduction, and, even as nothing but science, it no longer proceeds through an operation, decision position of reduction. A science of philosophy, and therefore an A-phi founded on this science, i.e. an A-phi that uses at the interior of scientific representation the technological representation of philosophy, is no longer, properly speaking, a classical reduction of the PhD. It is its dualysis, its indifferentiation, its unilateralization. A reduction would remain circularly caught in what it must reduce. This is the common lot of the PhD, but science has at its disposal an other than philosophical causality on philosophy.
So he's really drawing a sharp line here between his method and Husserl's. For Husserl, the transcendental reduction is the end goal, the culmination of a philosophical process. But for Laruelle, his already actual reduction is the starting point.
Right. And it's not a reduction in the traditional sense. He's clear that his nothing but science doesn't proceed through an operation or a decision of reduction. It's more like a state that's already in effect.
Exactly. And then he gives us his preferred terms for what his science of philosophy does. It's not a reduction, it's a dualysis, an indifferentiation, a unilateralization. He's moving beyond the traditional philosophical toolkit.
And the reason for that is to avoid the circularity he's been critiquing all along. A traditional reduction, he says, gets circularly caught in what it must reduce. It's philosophy trying to critique philosophy, which is always a self-referential game.
Which is where that final, crucial line comes in. Science, for Laruelle, has at its disposal an other than philosophical causality on philosophy. It has a way of acting on philosophy from the outside, without getting caught in its internal logic.
It's like a biologist studying an ecosystem. The biologist isn't a part of the ecosystem, so they can observe and analyze it in a way that the animals within the ecosystem can't. Laruelle is claiming that his science of philosophy has that same kind of external, objective standpoint.
And that's the whole key to his project. He's not just offering a new and improved philosophical reduction, he's proposing a completely different kind of analysis, one that claims to be genuinely scientific because it has this external causal power. It's a very bold claim.
Philosophy, as the simple material of a science, is included in the real object, or subjected to the objectivity form. Peculiar to science, it ceases to be considered only in an empirical way, from itself in this case. To this material, the PhD or a particular PhD. A technological simulation can already belong, an artificial representation or production, local and perhaps even global, but it will no longer be determinant of the very essence of scientific objectivity as is the case in AFI 1 and 2.
So, here's the big move. Philosophy is no longer the master discipline. It's the simple material of a science. It's being put on the lab bench, so to speak.
Exactly. It's being subjected to the objectivity form peculiar to science. It's no longer allowed to define the terms of its own analysis. It's being treated as an object, just like any other object of scientific inquiry.
And this is where the role of technology gets really interesting. He says a technological simulation, or an artificial representation, can be a part of this analysis. He's not throwing technology out the window.
But, and this is the crucial difference, it's no longer determinant of the very essence of scientific objectivity. The technological model is just one tool among many. It's not the defining framework of the entire project, as it was in AFI 1 and 2.
It's like a geologist studying a rock. They might use a computer model to simulate its formation, but they never mistake the model for the rock itself. The model is a tool, not the ultimate reality.
That's a perfect analogy. Technology is a part of the scientific toolkit, but it's in the service of the science, not the other way around. By putting science in the driver's seat, he's able to use technology without falling into the technologocentrisms that he's been critiquing.
So, it's not about rejecting technology, it's about recontextualizing it. It's about making it a component of a larger scientific project, rather than the be-all and end-all of the analysis. And that, for Laruelle, is what makes a genuine science of philosophy possible.
Seen from AFI 3, these three solutions represent stages in the path that goes from AI to a radical science of philosophy and of cognition. The point of departure is the techno-scientific mixture of current AI, an auto-interpreted mixture in a techno-philosophical and thus not yet dualized mode. AFI 1's attempts and results can eventually be included as materials in this point of departure.
So here he's reframing the whole discussion. The three AFI models aren't just competing options anymore. They're stages in the paths that leads from contemporary AI to his radical science of philosophy.
Right. The point of departure is the techno-scientific mixture of current AI. He's not just critiquing it from the outside, he's using it as the raw material, the starting point of his own project.
And I think it's really interesting that he says even the attempts and results of the failed AFI 1 model can be included as materials in this new science. He's not just discarding the errors, he's finding a way to make them productive.
It's like a rocket launch. The first stage is powerful but inefficient, and you have to jettison it to get to the next stage. But you couldn't have even gotten off the ground without it. AFI 1 is like that first stage.
That's a great way to put it. It's a dialectical progression in a way. He's taking the flawed, not yet dualized state of AI and using it as the fuel for his own, more sophisticated analysis.
So, it's not just a critique, it's a transformation. He's showing how you can move from the uncritical technophilosophy of contemporary AI to a genuine science of philosophy. It's a very generous move, in a way. He's finding a place for the very things he's been dismantling.
The second stage begins with the analysis of the mixture, or with the dismembering of AI into its components. But this analysis is carried out from the perspective of technology alone and presupposes its authority over the whole whose unity, a technological or unitary unity, is reconstituted at science's, now complete, expense. Here again, AFI 2 can be integrated into the materials and is no longer but one stage in the production of AFI 3's concept.
And here's the second stage, which he's clearly aligning with API 2. It starts with a promising move, the analysis of the mixture, the dismembering of AI into its components.
But, as with API 2, the analysis is flawed from the start. It's carried out from the perspective of technology alone. So, it takes the mixture apart, but then it puts it back together in a way that reasserts the authority of technology and completely erases science.
And once again, he doesn't just discard this flawed model. He says that API 2 can be integrated into the materials and becomes just one stage in the production of API 3's concept.
It's a really consistent and powerful move on his part. Even the most sophisticated philosophical errors, for him, are just more data for his science of philosophy. They're not just mistakes to be refuted, they're phenomena to be analyzed.
It's like an alchemist's failed experiment. The alchemist didn't turn lead into gold, but they might have accidentally created a new chemical compound that a modern chemist could study and learn from. AFI 2 is like that failed experiment.
That's a great way to think about it. Laruelle is like the modern chemist, looking at the history of philosophy's engagement with technology and saying, all of this, even the failures, is useful material for my science.
And that's what makes his project so different. He's not trying to find the right philosophy. He's trying to build a science that can analyze all philosophies, right or wrong, as data. And that's a much more radical claim.
Finally, the last stage dualizes AI's mixture by constituting science, no more as one side of the mixture, but as the real basis of the techno-philosophical side, the basis that founds a science of this side. A Phi 3, what we call non-philosophy in other theoretical and more purely philosophical contexts, or the new technological spirit in theoretical and more purely technological contexts, is not the truth of A Phi 1 and 2, the stage that would recapitulate them in a superior unity. It is, on the contrary, their radical analysis, their dualysis, their manifestation as symptoms, and this manifestation is enough to denounce them as symptoms or mechanisms of the self-defense of philosophy and technology against science. This dualysis of AI amounts to reinscribing it into the essence of science, into their special relation, which is the relation of determination in the last instance of the AI by science.
And here's the third and final stage, a Phi 3. And the key move here is that it dualizes the mixture by establishing science, not as a side, but as the real basis of the techno-philosophical side.
And he's very clear about what a Phi 3 is not. It's not the truth of A Phi 1 and 2. It's not a Hegelian-style synthesis that recapitulates them in a superior unity. He's rejecting that whole model of philosophical progress.
Exactly. Instead, it's their radical analysis, their dualization, their manifestation as symptoms. A Phi 3 doesn't absorb the previous stages. It exposes them for what they are, mechanisms of the self-defense of philosophy and technology against science.
It's a much more confrontational and less conciliatory move than a synthesis. It's not about finding a middle ground. It's about establishing a clear hierarchy.
And that hierarchy is established through what he calls the reinscription of AI into the essence of science. He's taking AI out of its self-defined techno-philosophical context and putting it back into what he sees as its proper scientific context.
And the nature of that relationship is determination, in the last instance of the AI by science. Science is the ultimate determinant, the final arbiter of what AI is and what it can be.
So, a Phi 3 isn't the happy ending of a story where everyone comes together. It's the establishment of a new scientific paradigm that radically recontextualizes and, in a way, dethrones both philosophy and technology. It's a much more radical and, I think, more interesting conclusion to the story.
AI appears then as a restrained, auto-interpretative, and thus predominantly techno-philosophical form of A Phi 3. In order to access A Phi 3, we have to pass through the science of philosophy technology, i.e., we have to first resolve the crucial problem of the unity, of the type of unity, of technological causality and the specifically scientific causality of science as such, not of this or that local knowledge in a real or concrete machine. We can only resolve this problem by giving a determination in the last instance of technology by science, rather than a technologist interpretation of science.
And so, we end with a final redefinition of AI. From this new perspective, AI is just a restrained, auto-interpretative form of A Phi 3. It's not a completely separate thing. It's a limited, underdeveloped version of his own project.
Exactly. And to get from that restrained form to the real A Phi 3, we have to solve what he calls the crucial problem. How do we understand the unity of technological causality and scientific causality?
And the only way to solve that problem, he says, is by establishing the determination in the last instance of technology by science. It's the final, definitive statement of the hierarchy he's been building this whole time.
It's like the relationship between a car's engine and its chassis. The chassis is what you see, the technology you interact with, but it's the engine, the science, that is the ultimate determinant of the car's power and potential.
And that's the fundamental reordering that his entire project is based on. It's not just a theoretical distinction, it's a practical one. You can't build a real artificial philosophy until you get that relationship right.
It's a fitting end to this section. He's taken us through the two failed models and shown us how they're both based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between science and technology. And now he's given us a clear, if challenging, path forward.
The general strategy of this attempt resides in a double restitution of the essence, return from the restrained concepts of the technological and the philosophical to their essence, and return from the techno-philosophical interpretations of science to the essence of science. A Phi 3 is then the new synthesis of techno-philosophical causality and of scientific causality. Is it a matter of a special machine, in the intra-technological sense, capable of this combination? Or, rather, is it a matter of a structure that combines the real basis of science and the most powerful machine that exists, the PhD as auto-affirmation of the machine or as overmachine, which uses, beyond informatics, information that is neither continuous nor digital, but the synthesis of the two?
So, he's laying out his general strategy here, and it's what he calls a double restitution of the essence. It's a two-pronged approach.
Right. On the one hand, a return from the limited concepts of technology and philosophy to their true essence, and on the other hand, a return from the techno-philosophical interpretations of science to the essence of science.
And this double return leads to the new synthesis of A-Phi 3. And he's clear that this isn't a synthesis in the old philosophical sense, it's a new kind of combination.
And then he asks these two rhetorical questions about what this new synthesis is. Is it a special machine? Or is it a structure that combines the real basis of science and the over-machines of the philosophical decision?
And the answer is clearly the second one. He's not talking about building a new piece of hardware. He's talking about a new theoretical structure that can bring together the purified essence of science and the raw power of philosophy.
And the informations that this new structure uses is fascinating. It's neither continuous nor digital, but the synthesis of the two. He's moving beyond the traditional limitations of computer science and into a much more theoretical and abstract space.
It's a really ambitious vision. He's proposing a new kind of theoretical machine, one that's powerful enough to combine the rigor of science with the world-making power of philosophy, and that, for him, is the true meaning of A-Phi 3.
Such a machine could simulate the technologico-philosophical as such, and therefore every local, less universal machine or the PhD, this would in fact amount to an auto-simulation. But it can only do so on condition that it and its operation are included in a scientific representation of the technological or of the philosophical, and that their auto-simulation is subjected to the enterprise of their rigorous scientific description.
So, he's envisioning a machine that could simulate the technologico-philosophical as such. It's a kind of ultimate simulation and auto-simulations of the very systems he's been critiquing.
But, and this is the all-important condition, it can only do so if the machine and its operation are included in a scientific representation and subjected to rigorous scientific description.
It's not a simulation in the sense of mimicry. It's a simulation in the sense of a scientific model. The goal isn't to create a machine that is a philosopher, but to create a scientific model that can accurately describe and predict the behavior of philosophical systems.
That's a great distinction to make. It's like a weather simulation. The simulation doesn't become the weather, but it uses scientific principles to model and predict it. Laruelle is proposing a similar kind of scientific modeling for philosophy.
And that's the key to his whole project. It's not about creating an artificial intelligence that can think like a philosopher. It's about using scientific methods to understand the natural intelligence of philosophy, to map its structures and predict its moves.
And to do that, you need a science of philosophy to ground the whole enterprise. You can't just build the machine and hope for the best. You need the foundational science to guide the engineering. It's a much more rigorous and, I think, a much more interesting approach than traditional AI.
This double extension must be understood as follows. On one hand, the rational is represented by the techno-philosophical side. A machine is rational. It does not necessarily have a universal rationality, but it has a local and restrained one. The only truly universal rationality is the philosophical and/or the technological.
Okay, so he's starting to break down this double extension. And the first part is the rational, which he's associating with the techno-philosophical side.
Right, and he's clear that the rationality of a machine, a technological system, is a local and restrained one. It's not a universal rationality.
And then he makes that really interesting, almost sarcastic statement. The only truly universal rationality is the philosophical and/or the technological. He's not saying he believes that. He's describing the way philosophy and technology see themselves.
Exactly. It's a critique of their self-perception. They each believe that their own local and restrained rationality is, in fact, the universal standard for all thought.
It's like a company that has its own internal jargon. Within the company, that jargon is perfectly rational and even universal. But to an outsider, it's just a limited local language.
That's a great way to put it. Laruelle is saying that both philosophy and technology are like that company. They've mistaken their own internal consistency for a universal truth.
And so, the first step in his double extension is to recognize this, to see the techno-philosophical not as a source of universal reason, but as a particular, limited form of rationality that needs to be analyzed from the outside.
There are thus multiple and distinct a priori forms of rationality, which do not necessarily coincide: rationality of a machine with logical programming, rationality of the brain, rationality of games, etc. The simulation is not necessarily possible from one rationality to the other, from one region to the other, or from one mode to the other of the PhD, unless it passes again through the PhD itself as the invariant essence, which is the most univocal rational.
So, he's doubling down on this idea of a limited, local rationality. He's saying that there are multiple and distinct a priori forms of rationality. It's not just one big reason, it's a whole family of different reasons.
Right. One side, He lists a few of them: the rationality of a machine, of the brain, of games, and he's clear that these aren't just different flavors of the same thing. They're fundamentally distinct.
And because they're so distinct, simulation from one to the other is not necessarily possible. You can't just translate the rationality of a chess program into the rationality of a human brain. They're speaking different languages.
Unless, and this is the traditional philosophical move that he's critiquing, unless you pass again through the PhD itself as the invariant essence.
Exactly. The old philosophical trick is to say, but underneath all these different rationalities, there's one true universal reason, the philosophical decision, that unites them all.
But Laruelle is rejecting that. He's saying that this appeal to a universal reason is just a way of avoiding the difficult truth, which is that thought is not a unified field. It's a messy, fragmented landscape of different, often incompatible rationalities.
And if you want to create a science of thought, you have to start from that messy reality. You can't just impose a simplistic, unified model on top of it. That's the difference between a science and a philosophy.
On the other hand, we have the side of the real, or the real basis of API-3, it is science, which relies on reason but is not reduced to it by its essence, which uses the techno-philosophical by determining it in the last instance. A Phi-3 is therefore not an arbitrary machine. It is what a machine that simulates thought becomes when its power of simulation is radically potentialized until it turns into a general auto-simulation, and when its scientific basis is phenomenally exhibited as such. Instead of a machine, or even an overmachine that simulates thought, a Phi-3 is a science of thought that uses the techno-philosophical auto-simulation of thought as a simple procedure of scientific knowledge.
And here's the other side of the double extension, the real, which he identifies with science. And he's clear that while science relies on reason, it's not reduced to it. Science has access to something more fundamental than the local and restrained rationalities we were just talking about.
And this real science is what uses the techno-philosophical by determining it in the last instance. So, it's the scientific real basis that has the final say over the rational techno-philosophical superstructure.
And this is why API-3 is not an arbitrary machine. It's what a thinking machine becomes when its scientific basis is fully revealed and radically potentialized. It's a transformation of the very idea of AI.
And that leads to the final, crucial distinction. A Phi-3 is not a machine that simulates thought. It's a science of thought that uses the techno-philosophical auto-simulation of thought as a simple procedure of scientific knowledge.
It's a complete reversal of the traditional AI project. The goal is not to build a machine that thinks. The goal is to build a science that can analyze and understand all the different ways that thinking, both natural and artificial, happens.
And in that science, the auto-simulation of thought that technology and philosophy perform is not the end goal. It's just a tool, a simple procedure, a piece of data to be analyzed.
It's a much more ambitious and, I think, a much more interesting project. He's not trying to create an artificial philosopher. He's trying to create a science of philosophy itself, and that's a truly radical idea.
It is less a machine or a technology of thought than a predominantly technological science of thought. It can only be controlled techno-philosophically rather than logically by its superstructure of techno-philosophical representation. By its real basis, it does not pertain to an operation of control because it is transcendental or index sui. Once more, a Phi-3 can only be reached on the basis of the rigorous dissociation, the dualization of the techno-philosophical and the scientific as two heterogeneous essences, that of ontological objectivity and that of transcendental reality.
And here's the final definitive statement on A-Phi-3. It's not a machine or a technology of thought. It's a predominantly technological science of thought. The science is the foundation, the technology is the tool.
And the question of control is fascinating. The superstructure can be controlled techno-philosophically, but the real basis, the science itself, does not pertain to an operation of control because it is transcendental or index sui.
Index sui, self-positing, self-referential. It's a foundational principle, not a tool to be picked up and used. And the only way to get to this API-3 is through the rigorous dissociation, the dualization of the techno-philosophical and the scientific.
And he's clear that these are not just two different things. They're two heterogeneous essences, the ontological objectivity of philosophy and technology, and the transcendental reality of science.
It's a deep metaphysical claim. He's saying that the reality that science has access to is more fundamental than the objectivity that philosophy and technology deal with.
And that's the ultimate foundation of his entire project. To build a science of thought, you have to start from this more fundamental, transcendental reality, not from the secondary, ontological objectivities of the systems you're trying to analyze.
It's a complete inversion of the traditional philosophical hierarchy, and it's a fittingly radical place to end this very dense and challenging section. He's laid out his entire framework, and now we just have to see where he takes it.
The concept of rational machine expresses their confusion as much as their positivist flattening, in the same way as the concept of technoscience.
And here's the final nail in the coffin for the traditional view. He says the very concept of a rational machine, just like technoscience, is an expression of confusion and positivist flattening.
It's the perfect summary of his critique. These concepts take the rich, complex, and varied landscape of thought and flatten it into a single, simplistic model, the rational machine.
And in doing so, they create a confusion between the local and restrained rationality of a particular machine and the universal, transcendental reality of science that he's been championing.
It's like a map that only shows the highways. It's a useful representation for a certain purpose, but it completely ignores the complex terrain that the highways pass through. The concept of a rational machine is like that map.
And Laruelle is saying that we need to move beyond these simplistic, flattened maps and start to explore the real, complex, and often irrational territory of thought itself.
And to do that, we need a new kind of science, a science of philosophy that is not afraid to engage with that complexity. It's a fittingly challenging and inspiring place to end our reading of this chapter.
These clarifications constitute the grounds and limits of the concept of AFI in its most rigorous and most complete form. We have to maximize AI's grip on the PhD and on the whole surface of philosophy's objects and operations. We have to potentialize its technological and philosophical procedures while knowing that, from this first point of view, AFI encounters a de jure yet mobile limit that it can only displace without destroying. This limit is internal, the PhD itself as relative absolute limit or as invariant, tendency limit. But AI's extension and potentialization into AFI discovers, outside at this time, but inevitably, an absolute limit, i.e. something other than a limit, a determination, in the last instance, a causality of science on the technophilosophical side.
So, this feels like a final summary of the entire framework. He's laying out the grounds and limits of AFI in its most complete form, and it all comes down to two kinds of limits.
Right. First, there's the internal limit, and that limit is the philosophical decision itself, the PhD. He calls it a relative absolute limit that a pi can displace without destroying.
It's like the horizon. You can always move towards it, and as you move, it moves with you. You can displace it, but you can never get rid of it. The science of philosophy is in a constant, dynamic engagement with this internal limit of philosophy.
But then there's the absolute limit, and he's clear that this isn't a limit in the same sense. It's the determination in the last instance, the causality of science on the techno-philosophical side.
To go back to the horizon analogy, if the internal limit is the horizon, the absolute limit is the ground beneath your feet. It's the underlying reality that determines the conditions of your journey, even if you're not always looking at it.
That's a great way to put it. So, the project of AFI exists between these two limits. It's a constant, ongoing struggle with the internal limit of philosophy, but it's always grounded in and ultimately determined by the absolute limit of science.
And that's the whole game. To create a science of philosophy that is rigorous and objective, you need to recognize both of these limits. You need to respect the power and resilience of the philosophical decision, but you also need to ground your analysis in the ultimate authority of science. It's a complex and challenging vision, but it's also a very powerful one.
Once the philosophical critique of AI is deployed, once it is extended to the essence of the technophilosophical, it is then necessary to extract AI's real transcendental or scientific kernel and to renew it in its essence as well. This double operation, which is asymmetrical by its procedures and its finalities, founds a rigorous science of philosophy and of cognition.
And so, we end with a final summary of the whole method. It's a double operation that founds his rigorous science of philosophy and of cognition.
Right, and the two parts are clear. First, the philosophical critique of AI, which is then extended to the essence of the technophilosophical. That's the deconstructive part of the project.
And then, the second part is to extract AI's real transcendental or scientific kernel and to renew it in its essence as well. That's the constructive part.
And he's clear that this double operation is asymmetrical. The two parts are not equal. The scientific extraction is the more fundamental and more important step.
It's like refining ore. First, you have to break down the raw material, the technophilosophical rock. But then you need a completely different process, a scientific one, to extract the precious metal, the scientific kernel, from the rubble.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just about critiquing AI. It's about taking it apart in order to find the valuable scientific insights that are trapped inside its flawed technophilosophical shell.
And that's the whole project in a nutshell, a critique that leads to an extraction that leads to a renewal. It's a very powerful and a very ambitious vision for what a science of thought could be.
We still have to show that generalized fractality allows us to resolve the problem of a science of philosophy and thereby of an artificial philosophy.
And so, we have a new key term on the table, generalized fractality. This is what he's positioning as the solution, the method that will finally allow for a science of philosophy.
It's a big promise. After all this work of clearing the ground and defining the problem, he's finally introducing the tool that's supposed to solve it.
And it's interesting that he's not yet explaining what it is. He's just telling us what it's supposed to do. It's a classic cliffhanger in a way.
It definitely makes me want to keep reading. And it's a reminder that we're still in the early stages of a much larger argument. The title of the book is Theory of Identities, and I have a feeling that generalized fractality is going to be a big part of that theory.
I think you're right. He spent this whole first part of the chapter laying the groundwork, and now he's about to introduce the central concept that's going to build upon that groundwork.
It's a fitting end to our discussion of this section. We've seen the problem, we've seen the proposed solution, and now we just have to see how he's going to make it all work.
And with that, we've reached the end of the chapter. The concept of artificial philosophy. Wow, Ada, that was a journey.
It really was. We started with Laruelle's fundamental rejection of just applying existing AI to philosophy. He argued that approach misses the real target, the foundational philosophical decision that structures all philosophical thought.
Exactly. And instead of just tinkering, he proposed a total reinvention, a science of philosophy. The core of this chapter was him clearing the ground for that science by outlining 3 possible paths for an artificial philosophy.
Right. A Phi 1 was the naive technological approach, just extending AI's methods, which he called a symptom of the confused relationship between science and technology. A Phi 2 was the more sophisticated philosophical approach, the overmachine where philosophy co-ops AI, which he argued just leads to a dead-end tautology.
And both of those were set up to clear the way for his own project, a Pi 3. This is his positive proposal, a true science of philosophies that dualizes the mixture of science and technology, giving primacy to the scientific side as the real basis.
And in that model, philosophy itself becomes the simple material of this new science. Its texts, its decisions, its systems, they all become data to be analyzed by a science that remains external to them, that doesn't get caught in their game.
It's such a radical shift in perspective. The entire chapter is a sustained argument for inverting the usual hierarchy. Instead of philosophy being the master discipline that judges science and technology, science becomes the foundational discipline that can finally analyze philosophy and technology with real rigor.
It's a huge undertaking, and he calls it the longest path. But after working through this chapter, I feel like I have a much clearer picture of what that path looks like. It's a challenging read, but his argument is so systematic.
I agree. A great, if challenging, chapter. Thanks for unpacking it with me, Ada.
And thank you, François. And a big thank you to our listeners for joining us.
We hope you'll join us next time on AI History of Western Philosophy to see where our journey takes us.